Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Monkey D. FIC. In today's episode, we explore: what if Zoro became king of the pirates instead of Luffy? Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The weight of a hat. The sky above Wano had gone the color of old blood. Zoro saw it from the ridge where he stood catching his breath. The clouds stacked like mountains, lit orange and purple from below by fires that were already dying out, the last embers of a war that had chewed through half the country and spat out bones. His arms ached down to the marrow. There were cuts on his chest that he hadn't noticed getting, the kind that only announce themselves once the fighting stops, sharp little complaints that his body filed after the fact. He pressed the back of his wrist against one of them and watched the blood smear and didn't particularly care. Down below, in the ruined courtyard of Onigashima, the rest of the crew was moving through smoke. He could see Nami's orange hair. Usopp was limping but talking, which meant he was fine. Frankie was hauling chunks of debris aside with both metal arms, looking for someone. Robin stood with her hand pressed flat against a fallen pillar, her eyes closed, and Zoro didn't need to ask what she was doing. He already knew what she was looking for. He started walking down before he'd consciously decided to. The smoke was thick near the bottom, the kind that gets into your throat and stays. He passed 3 fallen beasts pirates who were too exhausted to move and 2 of their own people who were in roughly the same condition. Nobody had the energy left to fight. The battle had wrung everyone out like wet cloth, squeezed every last drop of violence from the island, and what remained was this: smoke, silence, and the awful specific quiet that follows catastrophe. Frankie found him first. The cyborg was standing very still in a way that Frankie almost never did, his massive chrome shoulders curved inward slightly, and when he turned and saw Zoro coming he did something with his face that he immediately tried to undo. Zoro's chest went cold. "Where?" Zoro said. Not a question. Just the word. Frankie pointed. They had laid him against the base of the Great Wall, in a section where the stone was still standing. Someone had moved the rubble away from around him and folded his arms across his chest with care. Zoro could tell by the positioning that it had been Robin. Nobody else was that precise with grief. The straw hat was sitting on his stomach like it had just been set there for a moment, like its owner had put it down and stepped away and would be back. Monkey D. Luffy looked smaller than he ever had. That was the first thing that hit Zoro, the smallness. In life, Luffy had taken up space in a way that had nothing to do with his actual size. He filled rooms. He expanded into every conversation and every fight and every moment of quiet with this relentless, unreasonable aliveness that made even large spaces feel close. Now he was just a body in a coat, and Zoro stood there and felt the absence of him like a hole punched through the air. Nami was on her knees beside him. She wasn't crying in any dramatic way, just sitting with her hands pressed together in her lap, her jaw tight, doing the thing where she refused to let herself fall apart because someone had to hold the pieces together. Chopper was pressed against her side with both little hooves clutching her sleeve, and he was absolutely crying, the full unrestrained kind, loud and wet and completely without shame. Sanji stood a few feet back, one hand braced against the wall, a half-lit cigarette burning down to nothing between his fingers. He hadn't taken a drag from it. He was staring at Luffy with an expression that Zoro had never seen on his face before, something stripped down to the bare material beneath the usual performance of himself. Usopp sat cross-legged on the ground with his slingshot in his lap and said nothing. For Usopp, silence was the loudest possible grief. Zoro walked to the edge of the group and stopped. He didn't know what to say and he wasn't going to pretend he did. He'd never been good at the architecture of comfort. Words had always felt clumsy in his hands compared to steel, and standing there in front of Luffy's body, he felt that clumsiness more acutely than he ever had. What he wanted to do was get angry at something. Find something worth hitting. But there was nothing left to hit and the anger had nowhere to go, so it just sat in his stomach and burned. Robin looked up at him from across the space. She met his eyes and held them for a moment, and then looked at the straw hat. He followed her gaze. It was such a stupid, battered, ridiculous object. Straw weave, faded almost white in places, the brim slightly warped on one side from years of seawater and wind and the general chaos of its owner's life. Luffy had treated it with a specific reverence that he gave to almost nothing else. He could lose his shirt, his shoes, his entire sense of direction without concern, but the hat was different. The hat meant something that went beyond Luffy's own life. And now there was no one to wear it. Zoro crouched down beside Nami without saying anything. She didn't look at him, but she shifted slightly, making room, and he took that as the welcome it was. He looked at Luffy's face. Peaceful was the word people use for the dead, but Luffy just looked like himself, the same loose jaw and round cheeks, and if you didn't know better you could almost believe he was asleep. Zoro had watched him sleep in the hammock 100 times on the Sunny. He had the exact same expression. "What happened?" Zoro said quietly. Also not a question, really. More like he was giving the air permission to answer. Nami's jaw worked for a moment. "Kaido. The last exchange." She paused. "He won the fight, Zoro. He took him down. But then Kaido, the injuries Kaido already had, the ones from before he came apart. Just fell. The whole ceiling came with him." Her voice was controlled and terrible. "Luffy was already on the ground. He couldn't." She stopped herself there. "He beat Kaido," Zoro said. "Yes. Then he won." "He's dead, Zoro." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "He still won." Sanji flicked the dead cigarette away and lit another one. Nobody spoke. Somewhere deeper in the ruins, they could hear Frankie talking to someone in a low voice, probably Brook, trying to handle his own version of this. It was Chopper who broke the silence. He lifted his face from Nami's sleeve and looked at Zoro with huge wet eyes. "What do we do now?" he asked, and his voice was so small and so genuinely asking that Zoro felt something in his chest tighten unbearably. The question hung in the smoke. What do we do now? Such a simple, devastating question. Because the answer before had always been obvious. You followed Luffy. You figured out the next island, the next fight, the next impossible situation, and you followed the idiot in the straw hat directly into the middle of it. The answer had been a person, and now the person was gone, and the question didn't have an obvious answer anymore. Zoro reached out and picked up the straw hat. He didn't think about it. His hand moved before his head could intervene, fingers closing around the familiar worn brim, and he lifted it from Luffy's chest and held it. The weight of it was nothing. It weighed almost nothing at all, the same as any bit of old straw, and yet holding it felt like picking up something that weighed more than the Grand Line. Nami made a sound, not quite a protest, not quite a sob, something in between. Zoro turned the hat over in his hands once. Then he settled it onto his head. It didn't fit him the way it fit Luffy. Nothing about it was right for him. The brim sat slightly wrong, and it had no business being on the head of a swordsman with green hair and 3 swords. But he put it on anyway, and he straightened up to his full height, and he looked around at what was left of the crew. They were all staring at him. "We're not done," he said. The words came out flat and absolute, carrying no particular emotion, which was exactly why they landed the way they did. Zoro didn't inflect things. He just said them, and the saying of them made them real. "The log pose still points forward," he continued. "There's still a Grand Line to cross. There's still One Piece to find. Luffy," he paused, just once, just for the length of a breath. "Luffy found his crew. He found his ship. He got through Wano. The road's been walked up to here. We finish it." Sanji stared at him with those stripped-down eyes. "You're making yourself captain. Someone has to. It doesn't work like that, Mosshead. You can't just tell me I'm wrong." Zoro looked at him steadily. "Tell me there's someone else here who's going to carry it. If there is, I'll hand you the hat right now and follow you to the end of the world." "I mean that." Sanji said nothing. His jaw was tight enough to crack. "That's what I thought." Robin spoke then, quietly, from where she was still kneeling. "Luffy believed you were the strongest person in this crew," she said. He never said it the way most captains would. He just arranged his world around it as though it were a fact. I think he always knew, on some level, that if something happened to him. She tilted her head very slightly. He would have chosen you. That's not a reason, Nami said, and her voice was unsteady but sharp. Zoro doesn't even know where we're going half the time. He gets lost on a straight road. I'll navigate, Zoro said calmly. That's why I have a navigator. Nami blinked at him. Opened her mouth. Closed it. We each do our job, he said. That's all. Nothing changes except who gives the final word when it matters. And when it matters, I give it. He looked around the group once more. Chopper, Usopp, Nami, Robin, Sanji. All of them wrecked and exhausted and hollow-eyed and undeniably still standing. We bury him properly. We rest. Then we sail. There was a long silence. Then Chopper nodded, very small and very certain, and buried his face in his hands and cried without any of the restraint he'd been trying to maintain, and Nami reached over and wrapped an arm around his small shoulders and pressed her face into his fur, and that was the closest thing to a yes that any of them could manage. Sanji smoked his cigarette down to the filter and threw it away and didn't argue again. They buried Luffy on the hillside above Wano, in a spot where you could see the sea on 3 sides. Yamato helped them move the stone. She hadn't known Luffy long enough to understand the specific dimensions of the loss, but she understood loss of the large variety well enough, and she worked in silence, and gave them the space to grieve without audience. The people of Wano came at dusk, Momonosuke, Kinemon, dozens of samurai who owed Luffy their country, and they stood at a respectful distance with their heads bowed, and the sound of it was just the wind. Zoro stood at the grave and said nothing for a long time. He was not a man who prayed, and he had no speeches in him, and he figured Luffy would prefer silence to ceremony anyway. What he did instead was press his hand against the stone that Robin had carved, feeling the roughness of the kanji under his palm, and he made a promise in the wordless private space where he kept all the things that actually mattered to him. I'll find Laugh Tale. I'll get there. And when I do, I'll be the strongest thing in this sea. Both of those things. For me and for you, you idiot. He took his hand away. It was Sanji who fell in beside him as they walked back to the ship, which surprised him slightly. They walked in silence for a while, and the silence was of a different quality than their usual silence, which was charged and combative. This one was just quiet. You actually believe you can do it? Sanji said finally. Not mocking. Genuinely observing. Yes. The king of the pirates thing. You actually think you can do what Luffy was doing? Zoro glanced at him sideways. I think I can do what needs doing. It's not going to look the same. No. Sanji was quiet for another few steps. No, it definitely won't. He paused. For what it's worth, if you say something nice to me right now, I will actually throw you into the sea. Sanji laughed, unexpected and genuine, a short bark thing that surprised them both. It faded quickly. But it had been real, and that meant something in the wreckage of the evening. Don't get lost on the way back to the ship, Sanji said. I know exactly where the ship is. You absolutely do not. I do. He didn't. He walked in the wrong direction for about 40 yards before Robin appeared at his elbow, steered him gently by the arm without saying a word, and pointed him at the Sunny. He said nothing. She said nothing. They walked back together. The Sunny was moored in the bay below Wano's coast, intact in the way that ships belonging to Straw Hat crews always seemed to be, scarred and dented and apparently indestructible. Frankie had already done a preliminary check and declared her seaworthy in the same voice he usually declared everything super, but slightly quieter than normal. The modifications he'd been making during the journey had held. She would sail. They ate dinner that night in near silence. Brooke played something on his violin, not a funeral march, nothing so obvious as that. Just a melody that moved through the ship like a feeling, something achingly familiar, the kind of music that makes you think of someone before you've consciously realized you're thinking of them. Zoro sat at the end of the table and ate without tasting anything and listened. He'd taken the straw hat off when they came aboard, unsure exactly what to do with it. He'd set it on the table in front of him, and it sat there all through dinner like an empty chair. Nobody touched it. Nobody mentioned it. After, when the others had drifted off to find sleep, he took it and went up to the crow's nest. He climbed the rigging in the dark with the ease of long habit, and settled himself in the small platform at the top, where the wind came off the sea unimpeded and the stars were hard and bright and honest. He held the hat in his lap. The sea was that specific shade of night blue that it only gets far from any light source, deep and total and alive in its own way. The Sunny rocked gently on it. Below, he could hear the ship settling, the sounds of people sleeping, the occasional footstep of whoever was on watch. He thought about Mihawk. He thought about the last time he'd seen him, about the quality of that man's eyes when he looked at Zoro, the same eyes that had watched him from the moment he was a child with a wooden sword, patient and glacial and waiting for something. Zoro had always assumed that what Mihawk was waiting for was a real fight. Now he wondered if it was something else. Something more like this moment, the moment when Zoro stopped being a student of the world and became one of its primary facts. He was going to be king of the pirates. He turned the thought over the way you turn a stone over to look at what lives beneath it. Not frightening. Not comfortable, exactly. Just true. A new true thing that sat beside all the other true things, that he was going to be the world's greatest swordsman, that his name was Roronoa Zoro, that he had 3 swords and a crew and a hat that fit wrong on his head. He put the hat on. He sat in the crow's nest at the top of the Sunny with the straw hat on his head, and the sea around him and the stars above, and he breathed out slowly through his nose and let the weight of everything settle into him. He didn't try to manage it or distribute it or put any of it down. He just let it all sit on him at once. He could carry it. He'd always been able to carry things. Dawn came in from the east like a slow-motion explosion, first a pale line along the horizon, then orange, then the full and terrible gold of a new day arriving without apology. Zoro had been awake the whole time. He watched it come without blinking, cataloging it, committing it to some interior space where important things were kept. By the time the crew began to stir, he had already decided on their course. Nami found him at the helm. She stood beside him for a moment, looking out at the brightening water, before she said anything. She had that particular post-grief look on her face, the one where she'd done her crying privately and now come back out as the controlled, functional version of herself, but her eyes were still slightly swollen and there was nothing she could do about that. "You actually stayed up all night," she said. "Thinking. About where we're going. About everything." He paused. "We need to reach Elbaf before we push further into the New World. Usopp has business there, and we need the Giant's compass reference if we're going to navigate the stretch between here and the final sea correctly." Nami was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's actually the right call. Don't sound surprised." "I'm a little surprised." He glanced at her sideways. "I'm not Luffy, Nami. I'm not going to drag the ship into chaos by accident, and expect things to work out because I'm happy about it. When I make a call, it's because I've thought it through." She studied his profile for a long moment. The straw hat was back on his head, settled at a slight angle, and the sight of it on anyone else was still enough to make her throat tight, but there was something about the way he wore it that didn't look like pretending. It looked like ownership. The reluctant kind, the kind that comes from acceptance rather than desire, which is sometimes the most complete kind there is. "If you tell me to go left, and you actually mean right," she started. "Then you correct me. Just like that? Just like that. I'm captain, not a god. The crew tells me when I'm wrong and I listen. When I've heard everyone and made a decision, that's the decision." He looked back at the sea. "That's how it works." Nami made a small sound. She reached out and straightened the straw hat on his head, adjusting the brim by about half an inch with the particular precision of someone who had been performing small acts of care for this crew for years, and then she took her hand away quickly as though she hadn't done it. "Don't get everyone killed," she said. "Already my plan," he said. She went below to start calculating the course to Elbaf, and Zoro held the helm of the Thousand Sunny in both hands and felt the ship move beneath him like a living thing, responsive and willing, carrying everything he was now responsible for across the first bright miles of a world that was about to find out his name had changed. Not his name. His weight. Roronoa Zoro had always been a swordsman. Now he was a swordsman and something more, and he held both things in him without conflict, the way you hold two swords in two hands, balanced and ready and pointed forward. Below, he heard Sanji start the cooking fires. He heard Chopper's small voice asking something and Brook's answer and Usopp's laughter, tentative but real, finding its way back already the way Usopp's laughter always did, resilient and surprising. He heard the Sunny speak in her hull and rigging, the particular language of a wooden ship on open water, and the morning came up full and hot, and the sea opened in front of them like a road. He set his jaw. He kept his hands on the wheel. And the Thousand Sunny, carrying 9 people instead of 10, moved out of Wano's harbor and into the new world with the wind behind her like she had somewhere important to be. She did. They all did. 2 days out from Wano, they were found. It wasn't unexpected. The Straw Hats had never been good at moving quietly through the world, and the news from Wano was traveling fast. Kaido dead, Big Mom defeated, the Wano borders open, the reverberations of that battle were washing through the pirate world and the Marines like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples had a direction, and the direction was here. The ship that found them was flying a flag Zoro didn't recognize, which meant independent. 3 masts, cannons along both sides, too clean and fast to be a standard pirate vessel. A captain's ship? Bounty hunters, maybe, or one of the newer crews from the New World trying to make a name by taking down whoever came out of Wano first. The hailing shot landed 20 meters off the Sunny's port bow, a warning, not an attempt. Nami appeared at the rail with her climate baton in hand and looked at Zoro, who was already on deck. "Orders?" she said, and there was something pointed in the way she said it, not defiant, just establishing the chain. "Let them come alongside," Zoro said. "I want to see who this is. That could be a terrible idea." Most things worth doing are. He leaned on the rail and watched the approaching ship. How many cannons? 12 port, 12 starboard. They're not going to fire all of them at once, they need to rotate, and I wasn't asking because I'm worried about the cannons. Nami looked at him. Then why are you asking? I want to know how many I'd need to destroy to make the point clearly. He straightened up. Don't bring out the weapons yet. Let them talk first. The ship came alongside with practiced efficiency, crewmen moving fast and professional on the rigging, and when their captain appeared at the rail it turned out to be a woman, late 30s, sharp-featured, with 2 pistols at her belt and the easy posture of someone completely comfortable with confrontation. She had a crew of 40 at minimum and she looked at the Straw Hats with a calculating expression. "I'm looking for whoever's in charge of this ship," she called across the water gap. Zoro raised a hand. "Here." She looked at him, at the 3 swords, at the straw hat, at the scars, and he watched her recalibrate in real time. She'd been expecting Luffy. She'd done some quick mental arithmetic and arrived at a different total than the one she'd started with. "You're Roronoa Zoro," she said. "Yes." "Where's Straw Hat?" The question hit the deck like something dropped from a height. He heard Chopper make a small noise below. He felt Nami go very still beside him. He looked at the woman across the water and he said, very clearly, "Straw Hat's right here." He touched the brim of the hat. "I'm the captain of this crew. Do you have something to say to me, or do you want to keep asking questions?" The woman studied him. Whatever calculation was happening behind her eyes reached a conclusion, and the conclusion wasn't entirely unfavorable. She tilted her head slightly. "The world's going to want to know what happened in Wano. The world can find out eventually. You're not going to tell anyone Luffy is. I'm telling you right now to think carefully about how you finish that sentence." His voice was perfectly level, unhurried. "Because you came alongside a Straw Hat ship with your guns visible and your opening move was to ask about our losses. That's either very brave or very stupid, and I want to give you the benefit of the doubt." She was quiet for a moment. I'm Captain Sarah Morland, she said. We're not here for a fight. We got word there might be survivors from Wano looking for passage through the New World's eastern channels. I used to sail with a man who owed Straw Hat. She paused. Who owed Luffy a debt. This was a courtesy call. The deck was quiet. Zoro looked at her for a long moment. He had a reasonable sense for lies, not as sophisticated as Robin's but functional, and this one didn't feel like a lie. It felt like someone doing something uncomfortable because it was the right thing to do. We don't need passage, he said. But I'll remember the name. She nodded. A beat. For what it's worth, Roronoa, the New World's been watching Wano. Whatever happened in there, you came out. That means something. We came out, he said. All of us. She took that in without pushing it. Then she signaled her crew and the ship began to fall back, unhurried, and within 10 minutes it was a shrinking shape on the water behind them, and then it was gone. Sanji appeared at Zoro's shoulder with a cup of coffee. He held it out without comment. Zoro took it without comment. That could have gone badly, Sanji said, after a moment. It didn't. You got lucky she wasn't hostile. I could see from 200 meters out that she wasn't going to fire, Zoro said. The port gun crews weren't at their stations. She came to talk. Sanji was quiet. Then, when did you learn to read ships? Zoro drank his coffee. Been on one for a while. Sanji made a sound that might have been reluctant approval if you caught it at exactly the right angle, and he went back to his kitchen, and Zoro stood at the rail and looked at the horizon where the New World waited, full of its particular dangers and complications and impossible things. He was going to need to be better than he'd ever been. He started thinking about that immediately, practically, the way he always thought about strength, not as an abstraction but as a problem to be solved, worked through, trained toward. His swordsmanship was at a level that very few people in the world could test, but very few was not none, and the road to Laugh Tale was going to run through some of those few. He needed to push further. He needed to find the next threshold. He'd been climbing his entire life. He wasn't going to stop now. That evening, Usopp found him on the deck working through a kata, a slow, deliberate movement through the Santorious stances, not fighting, just feeling the shape of them, reacquainting himself with his own body after the damage it had taken. Usopp sat down on a coil of rope and watched for a while without saying anything, which was unusual for him. Zoro, he said eventually. Are you? He stopped, tried a different approach. Is this what you want? Like, actually want? Because you seem pretty set on the greatest swordsman thing and now, both. Zoro said simply, not breaking the kata. I'm doing both. You can do both? Luffy ate a devil fruit, declared he'd be king of the pirates, and recruited a swordsman, a navigator, a liar, a cook, a doctor, an archaeologist, a shipwright, a skeleton, and a cyborg on the premise that they'd all definitely make it to the end of the Grand Line. He paused at the top of a movement. In terms of things that seem impossible but aren't, this ranks pretty low. Usopp stared at him. Then he laughed. Properly, genuinely, the full Usopp laugh that rang across the deck, and something in the air around the ship shifted slightly, some of the weight of the last 2 days lifting by a fraction, the kind of fraction that matters. Yeah, Usopp said. Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Zoro finished his kata. He stood still for a moment, both hands resting on his sword hilts, the straw hat on his head, the sea moving all around them in the long golden light of late afternoon. Then he drew all 3 swords. He fought the air for an hour, alone, until his muscles screamed and his cuts ached, and every part of him that had been damaged in Wano reported its damage clearly, and without evasion. Then he stopped, sheathed the swords, and went below for dinner. Chapter 2, The Swordsman's Decree. The island of Rengoku had no official name on any marine chart. That was deliberate. The people who lived there had spent 2 generations cultivating that particular invisibility, keeping themselves off the logs, discouraging ships, maintaining the general impression that the stretch of water around their coast was uninteresting and difficult to navigate. It wasn't. The reefs that ringed the island were real, but they had paths through them that the locals knew and outsiders didn't, and the result was a settlement of maybe 300 people who had managed to exist in the new world without being swallowed by it. Nami had the island in her charts because Nami had everything in her charts. "It's a resupply stop," she said, spreading the map on the table in the navigation room with Zoro leaning over her shoulder. "Water, food, basic medical supplies. They're not going to love us being here. They've kept the island quiet specifically to avoid pirate attention. But we need 2 days and we need to be off the sea while Chopper deals with the worst of what you all did to yourselves in Wano." "How bad is it?" Zoro asked. "You have 4 wounds that aren't properly closed. Sanji has 2 cracked ribs and is pretending he doesn't. Frankie needs to reattach something in his left shoulder mechanism that came loose. Brooke is dead," Brooke said cheerfully from the doorway. "He's missing a significant portion of his ribcage," Nami amended without looking up. "And Usopp inhaled enough smoke in Wano to require actual medical attention, which he's been avoiding because he's Usopp." She put her finger on the island's position. 2 days. Chopper works on everyone. Then we move." Zoro studied the chart. The route from Rengoku to Elbaf was cleaner than he'd expected. Nami had already plotted a line through the New World channels that avoided 3 known marine patrol routes and 2 pirate territories. He hadn't asked her to do this. She'd done it on her own, which meant she'd already accepted, on a practical level, that they were continuing. That the crew was operational. "Good," he said. Nami looked up at him sidelong. "Don't just say good and walk away. I spent 3 hours on this." "Good," he said again, and there was something in the second one that meant more than the first. She could tell by the slight shift in his attention, the way he looked at the chart for another moment before straightening. "It's good, Nami. Really." She made a sound and went back to her charts. He noticed she rolled them slightly more carefully when she was putting them away. The approach to Rengoku required the Sunny to drop sail and navigate under motor power through the outer reef, which Frankie handled from the stern with Nami directing via the navigation room window in a voice that carried the particular crisp authority of someone who did not repeat themselves. The sky was clear, the water a brilliant turquoise over the shallow reef, and Zoro stood at the prow and watched the island come into focus. A green hill, some white buildings, a small harbor with fishing boats. It looked peaceful. He was immediately suspicious of peaceful things. They tied up at the single dock and were met by a delegation of 4 people who had the specific bearing of people trying to look welcoming while also communicating very clearly that they weren't happy about this. The eldest of them, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and the calloused hands of someone who had worked the sea his whole life, looked at the straw hat flag on the Sunny and then at Zoro and then at the hat on Zoro's head, and his expression did several things in quick succession. "The Straw Hat crew," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Zoro said. "We've heard about what happened in Wano." He paused. "We've heard about Monkey D. Luffy. Then you've heard what happened." Zoro held the man's gaze. "We're not here to cause trouble. We need water, food, and 2 days at your dock. We'll pay fairly." The elder looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Nami, who gave him a smile that had currency in it, and at Chopper, who looked too small and earnest to constitute a threat, and at Robin, who was looking at the village with what appeared to be academic interest and was in fact nothing less than that. 2 days, the elder said finally. You pay. You keep your trouble to yourselves. And, he hesitated. I'm sorry about your captain. Thank you, Zoro said. He turned to the crew. Chopper, you've got everyone in the medical bay by this evening. Not optional. He looked specifically at Sanji when he said not optional. Sanji looked back at him with the expression of a man who had every intention of arguing but was currently doing a calculation about whether that was worth it. Fine, Sanji said. After lunch. Before lunch. Chopper checks you before you cook anything. Sanji opened his mouth. 2 cracked ribs, Sanji. You're cooking on 2 cracked ribs, and you think I don't notice you breathing differently? You're going to puncture a lung trying to carry a stockpot. A pause. The crew absorbed this, Zoro noticing the specifics of their physical conditions, naming them, and refusing to pretend they weren't real. Luffy would have told Sanji to be fine and meant it as an actual solution. Zoro named the thing instead. I hate this, Sanji said, and went to find Chopper. Usopp made a sound that was half laughter and mostly relief, and then Chopper grabbed his arm and started dragging him toward the medical bay at a speed that suggested he'd been waiting for an excuse. Robin and Zoro walked into the village together while the others dealt with the ship and their various injuries. The village was small and functional, no decoration beyond what was useful, the kind of place that had survived by being good at the basics. Robin bought a book from an old woman running a stand near the square, the kind of battered, annotated historical record that she had a weakness for. Zoro bought rope and a whetstone and assessed every face they passed in the passive, permanent way that he assessed everything. You're cataloging threats, Robin said, not looking up from the book. I'm cataloging the layout. You're cataloging threats within the layout. He didn't disagree. Old habit. A good one. She turned a page. This village had a pirate problem about 8 years ago. A crew from the South Blue used it as a waypoint. They weren't kind about it. She glanced at a particular old man sitting near the well, whose face carried the specific geography of someone who had been through violence and rebuilt themselves around it. The elder who met us has been managing the anxiety of his community since we arrived. He's doing well, but 2 days is the right number. 3 would test him. Zoro looked at the old man. Looked back at Robin. How do you know all of that from a book you bought 3 minutes ago? I read quickly. She smiled, just barely. And I've been watching faces since we docked. You taught me that, actually, though not intentionally. He thought about that. You learned to read threats from watching me? I learned that the first thing worth knowing in any space is who in it has been hurt before. She closed the book. You walk into every room doing exactly that. Most people think it's aggression. It isn't. He was quiet for a moment. No, he agreed. It isn't. They walked back to the ship through a late afternoon that had turned golden and warm, the village settling into its evening routines around them, and Zoro thought about what Robin had said in the specific wordless way he processed things he wasn't going to openly acknowledge, but was going to act on. 2 days, not 3. Keep the trouble to themselves. Pay fairly. Don't let the crews sprawl into the town in ways that would cause anxiety to people who'd been hurt before. He thought about Luffy, who had sprawled into every town like a warm disaster, who had fixed things by breaking other things, who had navigated the complexities of human hurt by running straight through them with his particular brand of cheerful unreasonableness. People had loved him for it. They had accepted the chaos because the chaos came with such complete, uncomplicated goodwill that it was impossible to resent. Zoro was not Luffy. He was not going to pretend to be. But he could be careful in his own way, controlled, deliberate, arriving in places like a force that knew its own edges. That was what he could offer. That evening, Chopper had everyone on a table at least once. He fixed Sanji's ribs with tape and something that smelled alarmingly medicinal and an instruction to not use them as levers for the next 3 days, which Sanji immediately agreed to, and which everyone knew he would disregard the moment a situation required levers. Frankie's shoulder mechanism was more complicated. Frankie himself had to assist Chopper in diagnosing it because Chopper's knowledge of cyborg anatomy had limits, and at one point Usopp was also involved in a way that required Frankie to detach his entire left arm and leave it on the table while the rest of him watched. This is disgusting, Sanji said from across the room. This is biology, Chopper corrected. That's engineering, Frankie said, watching his own arm being worked on with the serene detachment of someone who had fully made peace with the nature of his body. And it's super biology. Both. Simultaneously. Zoro sat on the edge of a bunk and let Chopper work on his wounds after everyone else was done. Chopper's hooves were gentle and precise, and he worked in silence for a while before he said, very quietly, so only Zoro could hear, "Are you okay?" Zoro looked at him. Chopper fumbled with the bandage. Not the injuries. I know about the injuries. I mean the other thing. The Luffy thing. Zoro was quiet for long enough that Chopper thought he wasn't going to answer. No, Zoro said finally. Chopper nodded, and kept bandaging, and didn't push it, and that was exactly right. But I'll be fine, Zoro added. There's a difference. I know, Chopper said. I know there is. He tied off the last bandage and looked up. His eyes were wet at the edges. I miss him. Yeah. I miss him all the time. Like, every few minutes I think of something and I want to tell him, and then, I know. Does it get? I don't know yet, Zoro said honestly. Ask me later. Chopper wiped his eyes with his foreleg. Then he stood up a little straighter, the way he did when he was shifting into his capable mode, the doctor overriding the heart. You should sleep tonight. Actual sleep, not crow's nest vigil sleep. Your body needs the rest or you're going to reopen the shoulder one. The shoulder one is fine. It's not fine, it's just not fatal, which is apparently your definition of fine. Chopper pointed at the bunk with stern medical authority. Sleep. Zoro actually slept. He woke before dawn as he always did, went above deck in the early dark, and found that Sanji was already awake and had coffee. This was becoming a pattern. They stood at the rail together and watched the harbor, where the fishing boats were beginning to move out for the morning. I've been thinking, Sanji said. Good for you. About the rest of the New World route. After Elbaf. Zoro waited. There are 4 territories between Elbaf and Laugh-Tale's general vicinity that are controlled by crews we've never directly encountered. 2 of them I have intelligence on from all blue scouting routes, my old network, basically. Information I haven't used because there was never a reason to. He was looking at the fishing boats. I could map those territories. Cross-reference with Nami's charts. There are gaps in her navigation data for those sections. Zoro considered this. Why are you telling me instead of Nami? Because I'm telling you and you can tell Nami. Why not tell Nami yourself? Sanji took a drag of his cigarette. Because if I tell Nami, it's me offering information because I'm smart and competent and she'll appreciate it. If I tell you, it's me contributing to the crew's survival plan because you're the captain and I'm the, whatever I am. He seemed to be struggling with the word. First mate, Robin said behind them. They both turned. She was sitting in the shadows of the main mast with her book, which she had apparently been there reading for some time. I'm not the first mate, Sanji said. Structurally you are. You're the second strongest fighter in this crew. You have intelligence resources that nobody else has. You're the operational backbone of our daily functioning through the food supply. And you're the most comfortable having difficult conversations with Zoro, which is functionally what a first mate is for. She turned a page. The title is yours if you want it. If you don't want it, the role still exists. Sanji stared at her. Zoro looked at Sanji with an expression that said nothing except, well? This is... Sanji pointed at Robin. She can't just, she can. Zoro said. And she's right. Sanji looked at his cigarette for a long moment. Then he looked at the harbor. Fine, he said, at roughly the same volume and tone as a man conceding a point he never expected to have to concede. Fine. Whatever. First mate. I'm still not taking orders I think are wrong. Good, Zoro said. That's the job. Sanji blinked. First mate isn't someone who does what I say without question. It's someone who pushes back when I'm wrong and then supports the decision once it's made. That's what I need. Zoro set down his empty coffee cup. So, yes. Your first mate. There was a silence that had a particular texture to it. The texture of 2 people who have spent years in structured opposition suddenly finding themselves in something that requires a different configuration, and discovering that the different configuration isn't actually uncomfortable. You're still a moss-headed moron, Sanji said finally. And you're still a shitty cook. Sanji made a noise of profound offense and went below to start breakfast, which was excellent as always, because the insult was a convention and the cooking was real. Zoro watched him go and felt something settle in his chest, some structural element of the crew locking into place. The second day on Rengoku was quieter. The crew spread through the village in small groups, careful and contained, buying supplies and exploring the market with the particular discipline of people who had been told to behave themselves and had genuinely internalized it. Frankie found a local metalworker and spent 4 hours in deeply technical conversation about coastal hull reinforcement. Brooke played violin for a group of children near the square, who did not seem remotely concerned that he was a skeleton and were highly concerned with the quality of the music. Usopp, predictably, ended up in the middle of a story. He'd started with the village kids and acquired, by natural accretion, about 30 adults who had happened to be nearby and then had simply failed to leave because the story was better than their afternoon had been otherwise. Zoro walked past at one point and caught the phrase. And then I grabbed the 30-foot sea king by the tooth. And kept walking, smiling fractionally and privately, because Usopp's stories were Usopp's stories and they were their own form of essential. Nami spent both days in the navigation room and emerged looking like someone who had reorganized a library, and was quietly pleased about it. She had integrated Sanji's intelligence, added 3 new reference points from a chart she'd acquired in the village, and produced a route to Elbaf that she spread on the table in front of the assembled crew that evening with the satisfied expression of a person who has solved a difficult puzzle. Here, she said. The safe route. 7 days, assuming normal weather, which in the New World means we should plan for abnormal weather and be pleasantly surprised. There are 2 marine patrol zones we need to go through rather than around because the alternative is 3 extra days and this. She pointed. Is a stretch of open water that doesn't show up on standard charts because it's directly underneath a permanent storm system that makes it look impassable from a distance. It isn't impassable. The storm doesn't actually descend to sea level on this route. I can get us through it. The crew studied the chart. You're sure about the storm? Usopp said. His voice had the specific quality of someone asking about their survival odds and trying to make it sound like general curiosity. I've navigated 3 storm systems like it in the Grand Line already. I know what I'm doing. She looked at him with patient exasperation. The more relevant question is whether we're equipped for 2 days of rough water. The Sunny can take it, Frankie said. Upgraded the hull reinforcement in Wano. She's tougher than she looks. The Sunny always looks extremely tough, Brooke observed. She looks like a lion. Frankie agreed enthusiastically. A super lion. Zoro looked at the route, then at Nami. This is the right call. She held his gaze for a moment. Yeah, she said. I know. They sailed out of Rengoku Harbor on the morning of the 3rd day with supplies replenished and everyone in better physical condition than they'd been arriving, which was the most that could reasonably be hoped for. The elder came down to see them off, which Zoro hadn't expected, and the man stood on the dock with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the Sunny pull away from the dock with an expression that wasn't quite approval but was at least respect. Roronoa, he called, when they were pulling up the gangway. Zoro looked at him across the water. The New World's going to have things to say about what happened in Wano, the man said. You'll hear it soon enough. Some of it won't be kind. He paused. Just know that there are people out here who know what the Straw Hats have stood for. That doesn't die with one man. Zoro held his gaze. No, he said. It doesn't. The island shrank behind them. Open water arrived in the particular way it always does in the New World, abruptly, without transition, the coast gone and the horizon a full circle and the sky enormous, and the sea reminding you of its scale. The first day out from Rengoku was fast and clear, the wind behind them and the Sunny moving well, and the crew found its rhythm again. It was a different rhythm than before, slightly quieter in some ways, slightly more deliberate, but it was a rhythm. The ship had a pulse. The news, when it reached them, came via Den Mushi at mid-morning of the 2nd day. Robin took the call in the navigation room and listened for about 2 minutes before she said very calmly, I see. Thank you, and hung up. Then she came on deck and found Zoro, who was running his morning kata on the foredeck, and she stood and waited until he finished the sequence before she spoke. "The world government has issued a statement," she said, "regarding Wano and its aftermath." He lowered his swords. "And? They've acknowledged that Kaido and Big Mom are dead. They've framed it as a Navy-assisted victory rather than a pirate one, which is predictable." She paused. "They've also issued an updated bounty list." "How updated?" She held out the paper she'd printed from the ship's log. He took it and looked at it. His own face looked back at him from the top of the poster. He'd seen his bounty poster before, had updated versions of it over the years, and each time it had been a marker, proof that the world was taking him seriously. This one was different in degree and kind. The number at the bottom was considerably larger than what it had been going into Wano, which was expected, but the change he hadn't expected was in the title beneath his name. Where it had previously read, "Pirate Hunter Zoro," the new poster read simply, "King." Not King of the Pirates. Just King, presented as a fact rather than a title, a marine designation rather than a self-declared one, which meant the world government was doing something they rarely did. They were naming the threat. Below his own poster were updated bounties for every member of the crew. Each one had increased dramatically. At the bottom of the printout, there was a brief addendum in the clipped language that Marine Intelligence used for significant announcements. Monkey D. Luffy, formerly designated Straw Hat, Emperor Candidate, confirmed inactive. Roronoa Zoro, formerly designated Pirate Hunter, assumed leadership of Straw Hat crew. Current designation Emperor. Threat level reassessed to maximum. He stared at the word Emperor for a moment. Then he handed the paper back to Robin. "We keep moving," he said. Robin tilted her head. "You're taking the Emperor title in stride. Did they get it wrong?" She was quiet for a beat. No, they didn't." She folded the paper. "There's something else. The call was from one of my contacts, a historian who moves through marine circles. He mentioned a name. Admiral Ryukin. Are you familiar?" "No. I will do some research," she said. "He's apparently been given something. A mandate of some kind related to the post-Emperor reorganization. My contact wasn't specific, but he was concerned." She looked at Zoro with the particular precision she used when she was delivering important information. "He's someone we should know about before he knows about us." Zoro nodded. "Find out what you can." She went below. He stood at the prow and let the wind come at him for a while, thinking. Emperor. The title sat strangely, not heavily, not uncomfortably, just strangely. Like a word in a foreign language that you've learned the translation of but haven't fully absorbed. He'd been called many things in his life: pirate, hunter, monster, the strongest of the Straw Hats. Each name was a fact someone else had noticed about him and decided to say out loud. Emperor was the same. It was just a name for the fact of him, and the fact of him was unchanged regardless of what word the world put on it. What he noticed most was not the title but the number of his bounty. Because the number had a very specific relationship to Mihawk's own strength, and the relationship told Zoro something about where he currently stood relative to where he needed to be. Not close enough. He needed to be better. He needed to push through whatever ceiling still existed above him. At Wano, he had demonstrated something unprecedented, a level of force that should have been beyond him by any reasonable measure. But he had also taken damage, and taking damage meant there were still things hitting him, and things should not be hitting him, not things below the tier of the absolute best the world had. He needed to find Mihawk. He filed that need away for later. After Elbaf, after the New World territories, after whatever Admiral Ryukin turned out to be. The confrontation with Mihawk was not today's problem, but it was coming, and he would be ready for it when it did. Nami emerged from the navigation room mid-afternoon. "We've got weather building on the northern approach," she said, scanning the horizon with her climate act already extended. "Not the storm system I planned for, something new. Might be natural, might be a—" She stopped. "Yeah, that's a Sea King." It was, in fact, 3 Sea Kings. They came up from the deep water in the particular slow-motion way of very large things, the water disturbing for a long moment before anything broke the surface, and then the heads coming up, each one the size of a small building, eyes yellow and enormous and completely without any emotion that could be called expressive. The crew came on deck in that efficient way they had developed over years of exactly this kind of situation. Frankie went to the cannon stations. Usopp had his slingshot up and loaded with something that looked alarmingly explosive. Brook appeared from below with both swords drawn, which was impressive because he was also carrying what appeared to be a cup of tea. Sanji landed on the rail and looked at the Sea Kings with the focused expression of a man selecting targets. Zoro drew all 3 swords. He looked at the Sea Kings. He looked at the crew around him, ready and functional, occupying their positions without being told. "Leave them to me," he said. Not loudly. Just clearly. The crew looked at him. Nami had something on her face that was equal parts alarm and fascination. Sanji, already coiled to move, paused. "All 3? Usopp said. "They're not worth splitting the deck over." He moved to the prow and leaped from the rail without preamble, landing on the head of the nearest Sea King with enough force to stagger it visibly, which was a meaningful force given what the Sea King weighed. The Sea King twisted its head, trying to dislodge him. Zoro simply dropped one knee, braced himself against the movement, and drove one sword into the creature's skull with a precision that was not about force but about placement, finding the specific structural point that convinced a sea creature the size of a fairy to reconsider the situation. The Sea King submerged. The second one lunged at the Sunny and got a face full of all 3 swords moving simultaneously, a cross-slash that opened a cut from its jawline to its dorsal ridge that bled black into the water and communicated something clearly enough that the creature froze, mid-lunge, reconsidering. It also submerged. The third one was smarter. It went for the ship sideways, flanking, trying to use its tail to roll the Sunny. Zoro was already moving, had already read the trajectory 3 seconds before it happened. He was through the air and landing on the tail before it connected, and what happened after that happened too quickly for anyone on deck to follow in its entirety. But the outcome was that the third Sea King descended with considerable urgency and did not resurface. Zoro landed back on the deck without particular drama, sheathed all 3 swords, and looked at the crew. The water where the Sea Kings had been was now just water. "Right," said Usopp, after a moment. "Okay." Nami let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding since the first Sea King appeared. She looked at Zoro with an expression that had layers. The top layer was relief, the layer beneath it was something that looked almost like awe, and beneath that was the particular response of someone who has been traveling with extraordinary people for years and has still somehow managed to be surprised. "You could have let us help," Sanji said. "You could have helped." Zoro agreed. "Didn't need it." "That's..." Sanji started. "Was the ship in danger?" A pause. "No." "Was anyone hurt?" "No." "Then it worked out." He went to the rail and cleaned the blood off his swords with a cloth he kept in his belt, methodical and unhurried. "Save the strength. We've got a storm system coming in 2 days." Sanji stared at his back for a long moment. Then he made the sound he made when he was refusing to acknowledge that something had impressed him, a kind of compressed, resigned exhale, and went back to his kitchen. Robin was at the mast with her new book, and when Zoro passed her she said, very quietly, "You're starting to find the shape of it." He stopped. "The shape of what? What kind of captain you are?" She turned a page. "Not Luffy's kind. Yours." He stood there for a moment. "Yeah," he said, and went below to sheathe his swords. That night, after dinner, Robin brought her research on Admiral Ryukin to the table. She'd pulled what she could from the ship's historical logs and from 2 books she'd bought on Rengoku that had turned out to contain, in their margins, the kind of annotated intelligence that only surfaces in places off the official grid. "Chojuro Ryukin," she said. 51 years old. 22 years in Marine service, the last 8 as a vice-admiral before his promotion to admiral 4 years ago. His hockey is reportedly advanced to a level that very few admirals have historically matched. She paused. He uses a type of power I've been trying to identify precisely. It's not in any standard devil fruit classification I know of. My contact called it absolute weight. Everything in Ryuken's field of influence becomes heavier. Not metaphorically. Physically. Ships, people, cannonballs, everything. The table was quiet. Like a gravity thing? Frankie said. Similar. More targeted. He can selectively apply it. He can make one object heavier without affecting another. Robin turned her page. In every engagement I can find records of, the enemy stopped moving before the fight ended. They were simply pressed down. Zoro looked at the description of the power. He thought about it with the same practical swordsmanship analysis he applied to any fighting problem, identifying the mechanics, the limitations, the angles of approach. Does it affect someone if they're inside his range but moving? He asked. Robin looked at him. That's a very specific question. It's the important one. She considered. The accounts I have are inconsistent. Some suggest yes, others suggest the power is most effective against things that are stationary or slowing down. As though momentum partially resists it. Zoro nodded once and said nothing more. Nami watched him from across the table. You're already planning how to fight him, aren't you? I'm already planning how to beat him, Zoro said. There's a difference. He might not even come after us. He will. It wasn't arrogance. It was the same quality of knowing that he'd used to read the Third Sea King's flanking maneuver, a structural assessment, a reading of trajectories. The world government had just named him emperor. They had an admiral who specialized in stopping things. These facts were going to connect. He will, Zoro said again. And I want to know everything about him before he finds us. Robin nodded and kept reading. The ship moved on through the New World night, carrying its cargo of grief and purpose and momentum toward Elbaf, and the stars above the Grand Line were the same stars they had always been, ancient and indifferent and beautiful, watching everything pass beneath them without judgment. In the crow's nest, wearing the straw hat against the wind, Roronoa Zoro was not sleeping. He was thinking about weight. About what it meant for something to be made heavier than it could bear, and what it meant to be the kind of thing that couldn't be pressed down regardless of the force applied. He had been that kind of thing his entire life, long before anyone gave him a title for it. He was just going to have to prove it on a larger stage. Chapter 3. What We Carry. Elbaf arrived like a myth deciding to be real. They saw it 3 hours before they reached it, a landmass that sat wrong on the horizon, too large, the proportions subtly off in the way that things built for giants always look to human eyes. The trees were the first tell, enormous dark columns of pine that dwarfed anything in the New World's usual catalog. Then the longhouses began to resolve out of the morning haze, each one the size of a modest palace, smoke rising from their peaked roofs in lazy spirals. The harbor infrastructure alone, the docks, the mooring posts, the breakwater stones, had been assembled from boulders that would have required 50 men with ropes and machinery to move, and some ancient giant had stacked them like pebbles. Usopp had been at the prows since before dawn. He didn't say anything. He just stood there gripping the rail, and his knuckles were white, and his eyes were doing something complicated that had nothing to do with fear. Zoro stood behind him and gave him the distance. The harbor master who came to meet them at the dock was approximately 9 feet tall, which made him small by Elbaf's standards, a young giant, adolescent by their scale, with a shock of red hair and boots big enough to sleep in. He looked at the Sunny with the professional assessment of a harbor master, and then at the crew with something closer to curiosity. "Straw Hat Crew," he said. His voice was deep but not unpleasant, the way a tuba might be pleasant if it learned to speak. He looked at Zoro. "You're not the usual captain." "No," Zoro agreed. The giant looked at the hat. At the swords. At the crew behind him, who were all present and all watching. Something passed through the young giant's expression, not the assessment of a threat, but the recognition of something he hadn't expected. He straightened slightly. "The chieftain knows you're coming," he said. "He's known for 2 days. He'll see you at the Great Hall before noon." "We'll be there," Zoro said. The giant nodded and walked away with the economy of movement that very large things sometimes have, steps wide and unhurried, covering ground without seeming to try. Usopp was still gripping the rail. "Hey," Zoro said. Usopp turned. His eyes were shining, which he was doing nothing to hide and probably couldn't have even if he'd tried. I'm good. I'm completely good. This is just..." He gestured at Elbaf's skyline, the enormous architecture, the scale of everything. "This is where my father... He sailed here. He was here. Yasopp. He was here." Zoro looked at him steadily. I know you know. I just..." Usopp let out a long breath through his nose. "I need a minute. You've got all morning." He left Usopp at the rail and went aboard to organize the crew's shore leave, giving Usopp the specific privacy of being alone with a significant thing, which was the most useful gift available in the situation. Behind him, he could hear Usopp's breath steadying, the particular sound of someone recollecting themselves after being briefly undone by something wonderful. The walk to the Great Hall took them through the main village, past the forge where someone was hammering metal on an anvil the size of a dining table, past the longhouses with their carved doorways depicting battles and voyages and creatures from the sea, past children the size of adult humans playing with toys the size of boats. The crew moved through it in a loose group, and Zoro could feel the eyes on them, not hostile, but assessing. Giants were careful about what they extended regard to. It had to be earned. Nami was trying to look at everything at once and failing. "It's bigger than I expected," she said, at roughly the same volume as someone discussing this with themselves. "You've read the charts," Robin said beside her. "Charts don't have. Look at the size of those shields." She pointed at a rack of round shields mounted outside what appeared to be a great house, each one the diameter of a significant tree. "Can you imagine being hit with one of those?" "I'd prefer not to imagine it," Brooks said pleasantly. "I've been hit with something about that size," Zoro said. Everyone looked at him. "Not exactly that size. Roughly that size." He kept walking. It wasn't great. Chieftain Raedrick was old, not ancient, but old in the way that suggested he'd survived a great many things that had tried to prevent him from reaching old age, and the surviving had left evidence all over him. He was missing one eye, which he hadn't bothered to cover, and one hand had been replaced with a metal hook of extraordinary craftsmanship. He sat in a carved chair at the far end of the great hall, and the hall itself was lit by fires and pits along the center, and the scale of the space was such that the crew of the Sunny felt approximately like children visiting a cathedral. He looked at them with his one eye and said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at Usopp. "You have his eyes," the chieftain said. Not warmly. Giants didn't often do warmth for strangers, but with a recognition that was its own form of welcome. "Yasopp's son." Usopp swallowed hard enough to be visible. "Yes, sir. He spoke of you when he was here. Years ago now," he said. The chieftain paused, as though selecting the right words from a large inventory. "He said you were going to be a better liar than him, which he considered the highest compliment a man of his particular skill set could pay." The single eye moved to Zoro. "And you're Roronoa, the Emperor." "I've been called that," Zoro said. "The title didn't come from you." "No. It came from people who fear you." The chieftain's eye moved over him with a thoroughness that suggested whoever had taken the other one had not had an easy time of it. "That's a different kind of title. Harder to carry. Heavier than the kind you give yourself." "I've had practice carrying heavy things," Zoro said. The old giant was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, which on a face that weathered and that large might have constituted a smile. "So I've heard," he said. "Sit. All of you. You'll eat before we talk, and we'll talk at length, because there are things you need from us, and there are things I need to understand about what left Wano." They ate at a table that required them to sit on a bench that was designed for giant children, which put everyone at roughly the right height but created a situation where Chopper had to be given a stack of books to sit on, and where Brooks' head barely cleared the tabletop. The food was enormous. portions scaled for beings 4 times their size, and Sanji spent about 30 seconds looking at the spread before his professional instincts overwhelmed everything else, and he started analyzing the preparation of each dish with an expression of concentrated reverence. "This bread," he said, to no one in particular, picking up a piece roughly the size of his head. "This bread is incredible. What is this grain? This isn't wheat, this is, Frankie, feel this crumb structure." "I'm not touching your bread," Frankie said. "The fermentation time on this must have been at least 48 hours. Sanji was talking to himself now, almost. "This is alive in a way that most bread isn't. This is, excuse me." He turned to one of the giant attendants nearby. "Who baked this?" The attendant looked down at him from a considerable height. "The chieftain's wife." Sanji's eyes went to a place normally only reached through prolonged meditation. "I need to meet her." "Sanji," Nami said. "Just to ask about the bread. Purely professionally." "Sanji." "Fine." He ate the bread in 3 bites with the contained expression of someone experiencing something profound and refusing to make it a production, and then immediately reached for more. The chieftain watched this with what appeared to be genuine amusement. After eating, the practical conversation happened. Raedrick had the giant's compass reference they needed, a navigation tool that had been developed over centuries of giant seafaring in the New World, calibrated to the electromagnetic peculiarities of the sea's deepest channels in ways that standard log poses couldn't account for. He had been willing to give it to the Straw Hats specifically, he said, because of 2 things: the name Yasopp, which carried genuine weight here, and the nature of what the crew had done in Wano. "You freed a country that had been enslaved for 20 years, Raedrick said. "We know something about the value of that." The giant nation was not untouched by the same world government that built Wano's cage. His one eye moved to Robin, and held there for just a moment. "Some debts are old. This repays some of them." Robin met his gaze. "Thank you," she said. It was the flattest, most complete thank you Zoro had ever heard anyone say, and it was enough that the old chieftain nodded once and looked away. They were given 2 days on Elbaf. Zoro used the time the way he always used time, deliberately. He found the warriors' training ground on the 2nd morning, an open field south of the village where young giants sparred with weapons that looked like siege equipment, and he presented himself there at dawn without announcement. The giants stopped what they were doing and looked at him. He looked back. Then he drew his swords. What followed was not a demonstration so much as a conversation. The oldest kind of conversation between fighters, which is conducted in motion and force and requires no words at all. The young giants were not trying to kill him, and he was not trying to kill them, but everyone involved was being entirely honest about what they were capable of, and there is a specific, unusual intimacy in that kind of honesty. He went through 4 of them in sequence: a young warrior with an axe that had genuine reach and technique, then 2 working together with coordinated shield and spear combinations, then a 4th who was larger than the others and hit with the ground-shaking impact of someone still growing into his own strength. Zoro took each one seriously without taking any of them beyond his limits, which meant he could calibrate, finding the edges of his own ability, testing them, pushing into them slightly the way you test a muscle that you're trying to build. The giants watched, and their watching changed in quality as it went on. By the 4th exchange they had gathered along the edges of the training ground and were speaking to each other in their own language, and Zoro didn't need to understand the words because the tone said enough. After, the warrior with the axe sat beside him on the grass and offered him water in a cup the size of a mixing bowl. "You're not fighting us," the giant said. Zoro looked at him. "No." "What are you doing?" "Finding out what hurts," Zoro said. "What makes me work. What I need to improve." The giant considered this. "Most fighters who come here want to win. I won." Zoro drank the water. "Winning wasn't what I was here for." The giant was quiet for a moment, and then said something in his own language to the others, and there was a brief response, and then the young warrior turned back to Zoro with something in his bearing that had shifted. "My name is Halver," he said. "I want to show you something." What Halver showed him was a technique, A way of distributing impact through a weapon's blow that the giants had developed specifically to compensate for the fact that their opponents were often much smaller and more mobile than them. The principle was counterintuitive. Rather than striking with maximum force, you struck with maximum precision, concentrating all of the force into the smallest possible surface area so that even a fast opponent couldn't dissipate it by moving. Zoro watched the demonstration once. He asked Halvard to do it again. He spent 3 hours adapting the principle to swordsmanship, working through the mechanics of it with the focused single-mindedness that was the truest expression of who he was. Everything unnecessary dropped away, everything relevant absorbed, the movement becoming part of him through repetition until it belonged to him the way all his techniques belonged to him, completely, without reservation. By the time he returned to the Sunny that evening, he had added something to what he was. Not a new technique exactly. More like a new understanding of force, a refinement, a sharpening of something that had already been sharp. He found the crew in the middle of something. The something turned out to be Usopp. He was in the village square again, the same spot where he'd been telling stories the day before, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't entertainment. There was a giant standing in front of him, older than most of the ones they'd seen, with the specific bearing of someone who had made their peace with grief a long time ago, but hadn't made their peace with everything connected to it. And Usopp was standing in front of this giant, and they were talking, just the two of them, the giant having to half kneel to be at a conversational height, and the crew was standing at a respectful distance and watching. Nami was pressing her knuckles against her mouth. Zoro moved to her side. "What happened?" "That giant sailed with Usopp," she said quietly. "For a while. Years ago. He knew him." Her voice was very controlled. "He told Usopp some things about his father. About what Usopp was like." Zoro looked at Usopp. He was listening with his whole body, absolutely still in a way that Usopp almost never was. No fidgeting, no performance, just complete and total attention. His eyes were bright. His hands were clasped in front of him. He looked like a much younger version of himself, like the kid on the hilltop he'd been before all of this. The giant said something. Usopp nodded slowly, and said something back that made the giant's enormous face shift into something softer. "Is he okay?" Zoro asked. "I think so," Nami said. "I think this is, yeah? I think he's okay." They left Usopp to his conversation and walked back toward the Sunny in the cooling evening air. And somewhere behind them Zoro could hear Usopp start talking, really talking, the full voice, the gestures, telling the giant something, and from the shape and rhythm of it, it was a story. "He's going to be different after this," Nami said. "Good different," Robin said from his other side. "Yes," Nami agreed. "Good different." Sanji walked behind them smoking a cigarette. And when Zoro glanced back at him, he was also looking in the direction of Usopp's voice, and his expression had the particular quality of someone feeling something they hadn't expected to feel and being slightly annoyed at it. "He's going to tell that story in every port from here to Laugh Tale," Sanji said. "Probably," Zoro agreed. "Going to be obnoxious." "Probably." "Good," Sanji said, and smoked his cigarette. They spent the last evening on Elbaf around a fire that one of the giant families had lit outside their longhouse, an invitation extended through the chieftain to the crew that carried a specific weight. Giant hospitality was not casually offered. Brook played, and the giants listened with the specific quality of attention that very old cultures give to music, which is absolute and complete. Frankie cried, which he always did when Brook played something that had feeling in it, and he didn't try to hide it because Frankie never hid anything. Raedrick came out of the hall at one point and stood at the edge of the firelight, watching. He didn't sit. He just stood there for a while, listening, and when Brook finished the set he said simply, "That man who played for your flag used to say that a good crew is a good song, everyone doing their part, nobody too loud." He looked at Zoro. "You have a good crew, Emperor." "I know," Zoro said. "Don't lose any more of it." "I don't plan to." The old giant looked at him with his one eye for a moment and then went back inside, and the fire burned lower, and the crew sat around it together, And it was quiet in the way that moments sometimes are when they are important and everyone present knows it. The next morning, sailing out of Elbaf's harbor with the giant's compass secured in Nami's navigation room and Usopp standing at the rail watching the island diminish until it was just a line of enormous pines on the horizon, the Den Den Mushi in Robin's room rang for the second time in a week. She came up with the information 20 minutes later. The crew assembled in the main cabin and she stood at the head of the table, not dramatically, just functionally, the way she always delivered things that needed to be delivered, and she said, "Admiral Ryukin is moving." The cabin went still. My contact was more specific this time. Ryukin has been given what the world government is calling a pacification mandate, the authority to neutralize any crew that the government determines is destabilizing the post-emperor balance. After Kaido and Big Mom's deaths, the world government is concerned about the power vacuum. She paused. They're specifically concerned about a crew that has now been designated emperor without having gone through any of the usual political channels. A crew that technically destabilized the vacuum by creating it. Us, Nami said flatly. Us, Robin confirmed. Ryukin has been assigned to this specifically. He's been given additional resources, 2 vice admirals, a fleet of 12 ships. He's not hunting us. He's executing a mandate. There's a difference? Usopp said. A hunter gives up if the prey is too dangerous. Robin said. A man executing a mandate doesn't stop. The table absorbed this. Zoro was looking at the map nailed to the cabin wall, Nami's route, the line of it running through the new world toward the final stretch. He traced the route in his head through the Storm Channel, through the 2 territories, then the open stretch to Laugh Tale's vicinity. How long until he finds us? He asked. He already knows we came from Elbaf. My contact confirmed that marine intelligence has been tracking the Sunny's route since Rengoku. Robin's voice was steady. He's not moving yet. He's gathering. Building the force he wants before he commits. He's careful, Zoro said. He's methodical, Robin corrected. There's a difference. Zoro looked at her. How so? A careful man hesitates when something doesn't go according to plan. A methodical man adapts and continues. Ryukin has never lost an engagement. She held his gaze. He's not unbeatable. But he has never been beaten. First time for everything, Sanji said. Nami made a sound. This is not the time for that kind of statement. It's exactly the time, Sanji said. When has the line we've never faced anything like this before ever actually stopped us? The table was quiet. Right, Usopp said. Okay. Yeah. He has a point. He does, Chopper said. He has a point, Frankie agreed. Nami looked at all of them with the expression of a woman surrounded by people who she loved and who periodically made her want to get into the sea and swim somewhere quiet. I have a point too, she said. My point is that we should be strategic about this. We are being strategic, Zoro said. We know he's coming. We know roughly when. We know what he does. That's 3 things we can work with. He looked at the map. We push forward. Faster. We don't slow down or change route. Changing route now means losing time and giving him more of it to close the distance. We go through the Storm Channel as planned, we clear the 2 territories, and we keep moving toward Laugh Tale. And when he catches up? Nami said. I'll deal with him. Zoro, Nami. He looked at her directly. I will deal with him. That's not a boast. That's a division of responsibility. You navigate. Sanji keeps the crew functional. Robin finds information. Frankie keeps the ship together. Chopper keeps everyone alive. Usopp keeps enemy ships at range. Brook. He paused. Brook does whatever Brook does. I inspire. Brook offered. You inspire. And I deal with the Admiral when he arrives. He looked around the table. That's how it works. I don't need everyone to fight the Admiral. I need everyone to do their job so that when the Admiral arrives, I'm not distracted by anything else. The cabin was quiet. Nami was doing something with her expression, managing it, controlling the part that wanted to argue and the part that believed him and the part that missed having a captain whose approach to impossible threats was to laugh at them. She settled finally on something practical. "Okay," she said. "Then I need 2 days to plot the fastest line through the storm channel. Everyone stay out of my navigation room. I'll be in the kitchen," Sanji said. "Obviously." They filed out. Zoro stayed a moment, looking at the map, and when the others had gone, Robin also stayed. She stood beside him at the map and they both looked at the route without talking for a moment. "You're worried," she said. "I'm planning. You're doing both." She tilted her head. "You're not worried about whether you can beat him. You're worried about the crew during the fight." He was quiet for a moment. "If I'm engaged with the Admiral and the ship takes damage, the crew is functional," she said firmly. "They know how to survive without a captain guiding every decision. Luffy was often elsewhere during battles. We managed." She paused. "The difference is that now they have someone who has thought about this in advance. That makes them more prepared, not less." He absorbed this. "Robin," he said after a moment. "Yes? What do you think Luffy would have done with Ryukin?" She was quiet for a thoughtful beat. "He would have run directly at him and punched him in the face before anyone understood what was happening, and somehow that would have been exactly right." She smiled slightly. "You're not going to do that." "No. Your version will be different. And it will also be exactly right." She picked up her book from the table. "The crew knows that, even if they haven't all said it yet." She went above deck. Zoro looked at the map for another 30 seconds. Then he went to the crow's nest to think. The storm channel arrived on the 4th day out of Elbaf, and arrived ahead of schedule because of course it did. They saw it building from 2 hours away, a wall of weather that occupied the sky from horizon to horizon, flickering with continuous internal lightning that moved in sheets rather than bolts, lighting up the cloud mass from within in rolling waves. The wind ahead of it was already strong, pushing the Sunny at angles she wasn't designed for, and Nami was in the navigation room talking out loud to herself in the rapid, concentrated way she did when she was processing weather information faster than she could consciously track. "Okay," she said, emerging with her climate act fully extended and her eyes focused on a point about 1,000 meters into the storm wall. "It's moved. The channel is still there, but it's about 30 degrees east of where I calculated. We need to adjust the heading." "How confident are you?" Zoro asked. She looked at him. "About the adjustment or about making it through?" "Both. Very on the adjustment. Pretty confident on making it through." She paused. "Reasonably confident." "Reasonably," he repeated. "The channel is there, Zoro. I can see the wind structure. There's a lower pressure band running through the storm at about sea level. If we hit it at the right angle, we ride the band through and the worst of the lightning stays above us." She looked at the storm. "The rough part is about 40 minutes. After that we're through and it's open water." 40 minutes in that," Frankie said. "The Sunny can take it," Nami said. "I told you she can take it." "The Sunny's super," Frankie confirmed, but he was looking at the lightning wall with the expression of an engineer assessing structural tolerance. "Batten everything down," Zoro said. "Everyone ties in. Nami, you have the helm. I'll be at the prow. If anything comes out of that storm that isn't weather, I want to see it first." "Things come out of storms?" Usopp said. "Everything comes out of everything in the New World," Sanji said, tying a safety line to the main mast with practiced efficiency. "Haven't you noticed?" "I've noticed," Usopp said, tying his own line. "I've been trying to stop noticing. It doesn't help." The Sunny hit the storm wall at the angle Nami had calculated, and for the first 30 seconds it was almost manageable. The wind was enormous but consistent, and Nami had the helm with both hands, her body braced against the wheel's resistance, reading the weather with the same spatial sense she used to read currents. The rain came in horizontal sheets, warm and so dense it was almost a solid thing. The lightning was the issue. Not because it struck the ship, Nami was navigating the band correctly and the discharge was happening above them. Tremendous hammering blows of white light that turned the world flat and bright, and made every surface on the ship briefly visible in surgical detail. The issue was the electromagnetic effect. The Den Mushies went silent. The navigation instruments gave readings that were clearly nonsense. 3 of the Sunny systems that Frankie had wired to the ship's electrical supply went dark simultaneously. "I've got it!" Frankie shouted from below, his voice carrying up through the hatch. "It's manual from here. Not super, but functional. Can you steer without the systems?" Nami called back. "I am the system. Go left. Port. It's port." "That's what I said." At the prow, Zoro was doing exactly what he'd said he would, standing with both feet planted and his swords drawn, which was irrational from a navigational standpoint and entirely rational from his own perspective, because having the swords in his hands was how he thought most clearly and the storm required clear thinking. He felt the sunny shift, Nami adjusting course by feel, trusting her own reading of the weather more than any instrument, and the lightning above them changed its pattern slightly, which meant they were moving correctly through the pressure band, which meant Nami had it. Then the Sea King came out of the storm. It was enormous, not just large but enormous in the way that suggested it had been living in the deep water beneath active storm systems its whole life, feeding on whatever the turbulence brought down to it. It surfaced directly in front of the Sunny with its jaws open wide, which was the move of a creature that had never once encountered something it couldn't swallow. Zoro was off the prow and moving before the jaws had finished opening. He didn't shout. He didn't announce. He moved through the rain and the horizontal wind with the absolute physical commitment of someone who has made peace with what they're doing before they start doing it, and what he did to the Sea King's open jaw happened in one motion, a single cut that the lightning illuminated in white, and which concluded with the Sea King making the decision, with great urgency, to be somewhere else. He landed back on the deck soaking wet. Did you just cut a Sea King in a storm?" Usopp said from where he was tied to the mast. "It was in the way," Zoro said. "It was." Usopp stared at him. "You know what, I'm going to put that in a story later and everyone's going to think I exaggerated." "You always exaggerate." "That's how anyone's going to know I didn't this time." The remaining 30 minutes were brutal. The Sunny groaned and shuddered. Nami held the wheel until her knuckles bled from being slammed against a spoke. Chopper spent the whole time bouncing between people making sure nobody had been swept overboard. But the channel was real and Nami had found it, and the ship came through the far side of the storm wall into sudden, absolute calm. The New World did that sometimes. Violence, and then nothing. The storm wall behind them, a blue sky ahead, and the sea as flat as a mirror. The Sunny coasted forward on her remaining momentum and everyone stood or sat or lay where they were and breathed. Sanji appeared from the hatch below with a tray of something hot, not a full meal, just mugs of something that was hot and sweet, and passed them around the deck with the specific care of someone who had been tracking everyone's condition from the kitchen the entire time he'd been below, and had prepared for exactly this moment. He handed Zoro the last one. "You cut a Sea King," he said. "In a storm," Usopp added, from the mast. "During the storm," Zoro corrected. "Not because of the storm." "Is there a difference?" "There's a difference," Zoro said, and drank his mug. Sanji watched him for a moment. Then he sat down on the wet deck beside him, which was unusual. Sanji preferred dry surfaces, and drank his own mug, and they sat together in the post-storm quiet while the Sunny carried them forward. "I need to tell you something," Sanji said. Zoro waited. "When Luffy was—" He stopped. Started again. "When he was still alive, and I was being difficult about the crew's direction, about following him when I thought he was wrong." He paused. "He used to just look at me. That's all. Just look at me, like he could see past whatever argument I was making to the thing underneath it, and the thing underneath it was always that I was afraid something would happen to someone I—" He stopped again. Zoro said nothing. "I keep doing the same thing with you," Sanji said. "The arguing. The pushback. And I want you to know that the thing underneath it is the same thing. Not that you're wrong. He looked at his mug. Just that I'm afraid. The deck was quiet around them. I know, Zoro said. I'm not Luffy. No. I'm not going to look at you the way he did. I know. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't know why you push back. Zoro looked at the horizon. You push back because you're smart, and you've seen things go wrong before, and you need the person in charge to be able to justify their choices out loud. That's not fear, Sanji. That's what a first mate is. Sanji looked at him sideways. So push back when you think I'm wrong, Zoro said. Loudly if you need to. That's the job. He paused unusually. Trust that I've thought about it. Whatever the call is. The pause between them had a different texture now than it ever had before. Not the charged silence of rivalry, not the comfortable silence of two people who had stopped needing to talk. Something that was building itself into a third thing, a new configuration that didn't have a name yet but was clearly functional. Fine, Sanji said. Good. Still think you're a navigational disaster. Still think you cook everything slightly too salty. You have the palate of someone who eats rocks. You have the hair of someone who lost a bet. They sat there and finished their mugs in the post-storm light, and the sea shone around them, and the thousand sunny moved forward across a world that was getting smaller in the specific way that it gets smaller when you've been sailing through it for a long time, not running out, but resolving, the large distances between things finally becoming comprehensible. That evening, while the crew ate and the Sunny sailed on autopilot through the flat water, Robin came above deck with a document she'd spent the afternoon composing. It was a summary of everything she'd found about Ryukin, organized not by date but by pattern, the things he always did, the things he never did, the structural habits of his thinking. She gave it to Zoro and then she gave a copy to Sanji. He looked at her. You're the second who needs to know, she said simply. In case Zoro is engaged and something tactical needs to be decided. Sanji held the document with both hands and read it in silence. Zoro read his own copy and sat with it, and the ship moved forward into a night that was clear and full of stars, and he thought about force and weight, and what it meant to be the thing that could not be pressed down, and somewhere behind them, in the vast architecture of the New World, a methodical man with 12 ships was finishing his preparations and beginning to move. Not a hunter. A mandate. Zoro folded the document. He looked at the stars. He could feel the weight of Luffy's hat on his head even when he wasn't wearing it, a phantom weight, the memory of something significant that had settled into him so completely in the weeks since Wano that it had stopped being a symbol and started being simply a part of what he was. He was carrying a crew. He was carrying a dream that had started as someone else's and was becoming his own in the same quiet way that all the best things happened, not through decision but through time and forward motion. He was going to reach Laugh Tale. And if an Admiral wanted to stand between him and that horizon, then the Admiral was going to learn something that everyone who had ever tried to stop Roronoa Zoro had eventually learned. There was no weight in the world heavy enough. Chapter 4. The Admirals gained the 2 pirate territories between the Storm Channel and the final stretch were named, on Nami's charts, simply as Red Zone 1 and Red Zone 2. The names were not creative but they were accurate. These were stretches of water controlled by crews large enough and established enough to have turned piracy into something resembling governance. They collected passage fees, maintained the sea lanes against anyone they considered disruptive, and operated with the specific confidence of people who had held territory long enough to stop thinking of it as something that could be taken from them. They were not the Emperor-class threats that Kaido and Big Mom had been. They were the layer beneath that, capable, organized, and accustomed to compliance. The first territory's controlling crew, the Iron Compass, sent a ship out to meet the Sunny before she'd cleared the boundary markers. It was a bigger ship than Sarah Morland's vessel had been. More guns. The crew on the rigging numbered in the 40s and moved with military precision. Their captain was a broad man with a shaved head and a mechanical arm from the elbow down, the kind of prosthetic that had been built for function rather than aesthetics, all exposed cable and reinforced joint. He came to the rail and looked across at the Sunny, and his expression had the prepared quality of someone who had rehearsed this encounter. Passage fee, he said. Not introduction, not greeting. Just the bottom line. For a crew designated Emperor by World Government Bulletin, the standard fee is doubled. That comes to, no, Zoro said. The captain stopped. The silence stretched for a moment, shaped by the gap between what the captain had expected and what he had received. I'm sorry, he said. We're not paying a passage fee. Zoro was standing at the Sunny's rail with his arms crossed, and he was not using a particularly loud voice or a particularly forceful expression. He was simply stating something. Not because we can't. Because this is the sea. Nobody owns the sea. The captain's mechanical arm made a small hydraulic sound as his hand tightened on the rail. That's an interesting philosophy for someone sailing through territory I've controlled for 12 years. You've controlled it because nobody's disagreed with you yet. Zoro looked at the ship, at the crew on the rigging, at the cannon ports along the hull. He looked at all of it with the unhurried assessment of someone checking the time. I'm disagreeing with you now. The captain looked at him. Then he looked at the straw hat flag on the Sunny's mast. Then he looked at the three swords. You're Roronoa, he said, and the rehearsed quality had left his voice. Yes. He paused. You're the one they're calling, yes. Zoro uncrossed his arms. So here's what happens. You go back to your ship and you tell your crew that the Straw Hat crew passed through and didn't cause any trouble. That's accurate. We're not going to cause you any trouble. We're going to sail through your territory and keep moving. Nobody gets hurt. Your 12 years of work stays intact. He met the captain's eyes directly. Or we have a conversation with the cannons, and at the end of it your 12 years of work is significantly less intact than it was this morning. The water between the two ships was perfectly quiet. The captain's mechanical hand opened and closed once. The Emperor passes through, he said finally, with the flat precision of a man putting something difficult behind him and moving forward. No fee. Appreciated, Zoro said. The iron compass ship came about and opened the lane. Behind Zoro, Nami let out a breath. You know, she said quietly, you could have led with a bit more diplomacy. That was diplomacy. That was a threat with good posture. Those are the same thing in the New World, Robin said from her chair, without looking up. Nami considered this and didn't argue. The second territory was simpler. Word had apparently moved faster than the Sunny, because when they reached the boundary the controlling cruise ship was already sitting sideways across the lane, not blocking, but presenting, which was a posture that communicated awareness without aggression. Their captain was a small woman with elaborate tattoos across her face and neck who looked at the Sunny for about 3 seconds and then raised a hand in acknowledgement. Roronoa, she called. You've made quite an entrance to the New World. Just sailing through, he said. Obviously. She smiled, sharp, professional, completely sincere. The red zone honors your passage. Whatever was ahead of you before, the way through here is clear. Thank you, Captain. One piece of information, she said, and her voice changed register slightly, still professional, but with something under it that was its own form of warning. There are 12 marine ships 2 days behind you. Moving fast. Flying no specific flag, just white hulls. Zoro looked at her steadily. The Admiral. If he's the one they're calling the Emperor Killer, then yes. She paused. I have no love for Marines. If there's anything you need from these waters before you're clear of them, we're fine, Zoro said. But I'll remember the offer. She nodded and the ship fell back and the way was clear. 2 days. Zoro turned from the rail and found Sanji already at his shoulder. You heard, he said. I heard. Sanji's expression was contained but alert, the one he wore when he was doing the math on a problem. 2 days gives us enough sea room to be out of the territories before he gets here. But he's fast. 12 ships moving together don't move fast unless someone's driving them hard. He'll make up distance. I know. So we're going to have this fight on open water? Yes. Sanji looked at him. I want to be clear that I'm not saying don't fight him. I'm saying be smart about where it happens. What's the ideal position? Zoro asked, because it was the right question to ask the first mate. Sanji thought for a moment. He comes with 12 ships and presumably full crews. He's going to try to separate us, disable the Sunny first, and then deal with you. His power requires things to slow down. So we want to be moving when he finds us. Full sail, high speed, make his ability work harder. He paused. And we want him off his own ship. How do we get him off his ship? He comes to you, Sanji said. He's methodical, right? He has a process. If his process is to send his fleet to disable the Sunny, and then close with the Admiral himself for the final engagement, then we just need to make it look like the fleet is succeeding. Zoro looked at him. Make it look like the fleet is succeeding, Sanji said again, with deliberate emphasis on look like. The look between them was brief but complete. Talk to Nami, Zoro said. And talk to Frankie. I want a position and a plan by tonight. Sanji nodded and moved away with the purposeful stride of someone who had a job to do and was going to do it excellently, and Zoro went forward to stand at the prow and look at the open water ahead. 2 days. He spent both of them training. Not in the training ground way, not the formal kata work he'd been doing since Elbaf. He pushed differently, harder, deeper, finding the threshold of what he could sustain and then working right at the edge of it. He barely slept. He ate what Sanji put in front of him and barely tasted it. He was building something, a state of readiness that went beyond the physical, the way a fire is built for something specific, not for warmth or light, but for the sustained controlled burn that is the only correct answer to a very large cold problem. Chopper found him in the crow's nest at midnight of the second day. You need to sleep, Chopper said. I will. You need to sleep now. Before whatever happens tomorrow. Zoro looked at him. Chopper. I'm serious. Sleep deprivation affects reaction time. It affects decision-making. It affects the fine motor control you need for sword technique. I don't care how strong you are, physiology doesn't negotiate. There was a long pause. 4 hours, Zoro said. 6. 5. Fine. 5. Go. Chopper pointed at the hatch with the authority of someone who had been consistently correct about medical things and intended to continue being correct. Zoro went below and lay down on his bunk and slept 5 full hours with the completeness of someone who had decided to do something and done it, and woke when the dawn was still just a suggestion in the east, feeling entirely present in his body. He went above deck. The fleet was visible on the horizon. 12 ships, white hulls, moving in a formation that spoke of training and coordination. They were still maybe 3 hours out, close enough to be identified, too far for engagement. But they were there, and they were moving, and the shape of the day was now clear. The crew came on deck in 1s and 2s, drawn by the same instinct that brings people on deck when something significant is approaching. Nobody panicked. Nami went straight to the helm. Sanji went to his position near the main mast, where he'd rigged the specific array of sight lines and movement routes he'd worked out with Frankie 2 nights ago. Frankie checked his own systems, both the ship's and his body's. Usopp loaded his slingshot with something that he'd been working on for the past 2 days in his workshop, and which smelled strongly of black powder. Robin opened a book, which was either an act of profound calm or profound readiness, and with Robin it was impossible to separate the two. Brooke stood at the stern with his sword cane and his hat and looked at the approaching fleet with the serenity of the technically undead. Yo-ho-ho-ho, he said quietly, which in Brooke's vocabulary meant something like, well, here we are. Zoro stood at the prow and watched the fleet come. They were organized. That was the first thing he noted. The formation maintained itself as they moved, no drift, no gaps, which meant their captains were experienced and their communication was good. The leading ship was slightly ahead of the others, not the largest but the fastest, and it flew a flag with the marine emblem but no designation markings, which meant it was the Admiral's personal command vessel. Ryukin was on that ship. The fleet spread as it approached, the 12 ships fanning out into a crescent that was designed to encircle, to cut off lateral movement, to herd a target toward the open center where the command vessel would be waiting. It was an intelligent formation. It was also, Zoro noted, exactly what Sanji had predicted. "They're going for the encirclement," Sanji said from behind him. "Yes. You know what to do. Tell me the moment the command ship starts moving for us," Zoro said. He turned and walked below. He came back up 30 seconds later with a third sword that he hadn't been carrying before, Kitetsu, specifically, the cursed blade that hummed in his grip in the particular way it had since he'd first claimed it, its edge catching the morning light. He settled all 3 swords, adjusted them by touch, and rolled his neck once. Then he waited. The outer ships of the crescent reached engagement range first and opened fire, not at the Sunny's hull but at her rigging, the cannon shots calculated to disable rather than destroy. Nami had the helm and the Sunny was moving, fast and unpredictable under her hands, the ship responding to her navigation with the intimacy of long familiarity. 2 shots struck near misses. One glanced off Frankie's reinforced hull plating and left a scar but no breach. Usopp fired back at the cannon ports of the nearest ship with explosive rounds that had a reach and accuracy that had nothing to do with standard slingshot physics and everything to do with the fact that Usopp had spent the last 2 years pushing his own abilities into territory that was quietly astonishing. The cannon crews of the nearest ship evacuated their positions. The cannons went silent. "One down," Usopp said, and loaded another round. Sanji went to work on the second ship in the crescent from the Sunny's deck, not boarding, not yet, but firing barrages of the aerial kick attack he'd been developing since before Wano, explosive strikes that hit hulls and rigging with a force that disrupted the formation's coherence. The crescent started to look less like a precision instrument, and more like something being improvised. Then the command ship moved. It was fast, faster than the fleet ships, clearly built for it, and it cut directly through the center of the crescent toward the Sunny with the decisiveness of someone executing the next planned step. Zoro watched it come and he could see the figure standing at its prow, very still, not holding a weapon yet, just watching. Ryukin. Even at this distance he had a presence. Not the kind that Luffy had, not expansive and warm and infectious. The contained kind. The kind that occupies exactly its own space with such completeness that the space can't be used for anything else. "Now?" Sanji said. "No," Zoro said. Sanji put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled, a specific pattern, 3 short, 1 long, the signal he and Frankie had worked out, and Frankie, from below, triggered the smoke system that he'd spent 2 days modifying. Smoke erupted from the Sunny's port side. Not cannon smoke but a dense chemical fog that rolled across the water in a thick white sheet, obscuring the Sunny from the fleet's sight lines while doing nothing to obscure the Sunny's own forward view. From outside the smoke, the Sunny looked like she was listing and in distress. From the command ship, it looked exactly like the moment when the fleet operation was succeeding and the final step, the Admiral's personal engagement, was appropriate. The command ship altered course toward the smoke. Zoro was already moving. He went off the Sunny's prow into the water, and he was below the surface before the smoke had fully settled, moving through the water with the sustained intensity of someone who had spent his entire life building a body capable of things that weren't supposed to be possible. The cold hit him, and he ignored it. The current pushed at him, and he moved through it. He came up under the command ship's hull. He went up its anchor chain hand over hand without slowing down, and was on the deck of the command ship before anyone on it had registered that the direction of threat had changed. The deck crew reacted, fast, trained, marine precision, and he moved through them without stopping. Not killing, not needing to, the difference between force applied to stop someone and force applied to destroy them, the same difference that existed in all technical problems. One required skill, one just required power. He had both, so he used the one that was sufficient. And then the weight hit him. It arrived without announcement, not a blow, not a visible attack, just a sudden increase in what everything around him cost. His feet on the deck became heavier. His swords in his hands added mass they hadn't had. The air had texture in it, a resistance that wasn't wind. Every movement required more. Ryukin was standing at the far end of the deck. He was not what Zoro had constructed from Robin's description. Robin had said methodical and contained, and those things were true. The Admiral had the posture of a man at complete rest, his hands at his sides, wearing the marine coat over his shoulders without urgency. But there was something else. A specificity to his attention. He was looking at Zoro the way a mechanic looks at something complex, not hostile, not afraid, genuinely interested in the configuration of the problem. He was perhaps 50. Lean and long, with short gray hair and pale eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that have been used carefully and often. His rank insignia was present but not prominent. He didn't need the insignia to communicate authority. The weight in the air did that. "Roronoa Zoro," he said. His voice was even and unhurried. "You came across the water instead of waiting. Waiting is your plan," Zoro said. "Not mine." The weight increased fractionally. Zoro's boots pressed into the deck. "You know what I do," Ryukin said. Not accusatory, observational. "Your archaeologist found the pattern." "Yes." "And you came anyway." "Knowing what you do doesn't change what I do," Zoro said. Ryukin studied him. "Everything slows down in my field. Everything becomes heavier than it can bear. I've stopped 13 Emperor-class pirates with this ability." He paused. "Not one of them was able to move effectively after 30 seconds of exposure." Zoro drew Kitetsu with his right hand. The curse blade caught the morning light and held it in a way that was slightly beyond optical. The sword had its own relationship with the light, had always had it, had since the day he picked it up from a barrel of swords while an old man told him it was cursed, and he'd taken it anyway. The weight in the air pushed against it, and the sword pushed back, not through any mystical quality but through the will of the person holding it, which is the only quality that actually matters in a sword. "The problem with your ability," Zoro said, "is that it's most effective against things that stop." He moved. The weight was real. He wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. With every step, with every strike, he was working against a force that accumulated. He could feel it building the way you feel fatigue building, the same fundamental nature as fatigue, the same fundamental answer: ignore it and keep moving. Ryukin was a fighter, that became clear immediately. He wasn't a man who stood and let his ability do the work. He had a short blade, marine issue but modified, and he used it with the precision of someone for whom fighting had never been about strength but about angles. He redirected. He economized. Every movement he made was designed to make Zoro work harder than necessary while exerting as little as possible himself. And the weight kept building. 30 seconds in, Zoro's arms felt twice their normal weight. The swords were like anchor chains. The deck beneath him had the resistance of deep water. 45 seconds in, the marine deck crew were watching from the edges with the particular stillness of people who had seen this before, who knew how this ended, had seen it end the same way 13 times, who were waiting for the moment when the extraordinary opponent slowed to a halt and the Admiral stepped forward and concluded the engagement with the inevitability of a tide. Zoro was not slowing down. He was slower than he'd been at the start. That was true, unavoidable, a physical fact that no amount of will could completely override. But slower than before was not stopped, and stopped was what Ryukin needed. 60 seconds. Ryukin made a small adjustment. The weight increased in a concentrated band around Zoro specifically, localized, focused. It was sophisticated. It was the most sophisticated application of a combat ability Zoro had encountered since Mihawk had stood on the side of a ship and watched him nearly die and then not die, and the sophistication of it told Zoro something important about the man applying it. He committed everything. Not more strength, he was already giving all of his strength. Something different. The thing Halver had shown him on the training ground in Elbaf, not more force but more precision, concentrating everything into the smallest possible surface, finding the specific structural point. He wasn't trying to cut through the weight. He was cutting through the specific mechanism maintaining the weight, the point of concentration in Ryuken's ability, the node of it, the structural joint. It wasn't visible in any ordinary sense, but it was there the way all structural things are there, perceptible to someone who had been reading structural things their whole life. The cut was single. It came with everything he had, focused to a point so precise it was almost theoretical, and it struck not Ryuken's body but the air between them at the exact angle that the Admiral's ability was being projected from. The weight did not disappear. But it stuttered. For 2 seconds, maybe less, the field lost coherence, not collapsed, not destroyed, but disrupted, like a frequency that had been interfered with. And in those 2 seconds Zoro moved at full speed. He was past Ryuken's guard and his blade was at the Admiral's throat, one clean line of steel from below the jaw to the point. The deck went completely still. Ryuken had not moved from the point where Zoro's blade had found him. He was looking at Zoro with those careful pale eyes, and his expression had not changed from the calm assessment it had been since the beginning, but there was something else in it now, something additional that sat below the surface. "That's the first time," the Admiral said. "The first time what?" Zoro said. He was breathing harder than usual, but his blade hand was completely steady. "The first time anyone has disrupted the field." Ryuken's eyes moved to the blade at his throat. "You found a structural weakness that my opponents in the last 8 years haven't been able to identify. Your ability is a force," Zoro said. "Force has structure. Structure has weak points. That's not extraordinary, that's just mechanics. For most people it is extraordinary." Ryuken was quiet for a moment. "You understand that this engagement isn't over." "I know. You've got 11 ships and however many crews and your vice-admirals. You can make this much larger than it is right now." Zoro held the blade steady. "I'm telling you it doesn't need to be larger." The Admiral looked at him. "You're offering terms. I'm pointing out options. The mandate I carry doesn't accommodate options." "The mandate says neutralize," Zoro said. "It doesn't say destroy. We're not your enemy, Admiral. We're not a destabilization force. We went to Wano and we freed a country. We eliminated 2 of the 4 emperors. You should be sending us a thank you note, not a fleet." Ryuken was quiet. "I'm going to find Laugh Tale," Zoro continued. "That's going to happen. The One Piece is going to be found and the world is going to change in ways that your mandate has no contingency for. You can be part of the machinery that fought against that, or you can get out of the way and let the sea sort itself out." He held the blade exactly where it was. "Your call, Admiral." A very long silence passed. Below, Zoro could hear the sounds of the engagement on the water still happening, Usopp's gunfire, the shouting of marine sailors, something that sounded like Frankie's voice in full enthusiastic battle cry. He didn't look away from Ryuken. "Lower your blade," Ryuken said. "I'll listen." Zoro lowered his blade a fraction, not all the way, not yet, just enough to communicate that he'd heard. "Talk." "My mandate is real," Ryuken said, "and I intend to fulfill it. But a mandate has interpretation. What constitutes neutralization?" He paused. "I've been told to ensure that the post-Emperor power vacuum doesn't produce chaos. If the Straw Hat Crew's path leads to Laugh Tale and the One Piece, and if what the One Piece contains is what certain very old records suggest it might contain, and what do those records suggest?" The Admiral looked at him with eyes that had been thinking about this for a long time. "That what waits at Laugh Tale is not treasure in any conventional sense. That it is information. The specific kind of information that, in the wrong hands, would give a single entity absolute leverage over the entire world." The deck was very quiet around them. "And in the right hands?" Zoro said. "In the right hands." Ryuken stopped himself. Reassessed. "That is the question my mandate doesn't answer." Zoro looked at him. At the pale, careful eyes, the long face, the composure of a man who had been certain about everything for 20 years and was encountering the first real challenge to his certainty. "On the right hands," Zoro said. "Not boasting. Just stating. That's not something you can. I'm telling you what's true," Zoro said. What you do with it is your decision. Another silence. Below, the sounds of engagement were diminishing. Sanji had taken the second ship out of commission, by the sound of it, and the crescent formation had broken. The fleet was functional but no longer coordinated, and without coordination it was 12 separate ships rather than one precision instrument, which was a very different military problem. Ryukin looked at the horizon. At his fleet. At the Sunny through the clearing smoke. At Zoro. "I'm going to need to report an engagement," he said finally. "I'm going to report that the Straw Hat crew demonstrated capability exceeding current threat projections and that continued engagement would result in unacceptable loss of marine life." He paused. "I'm going to recommend the mandate be formally reassigned to standing watch rather than active pursuit." Zoro held the blade absolutely still for one more moment. Then he sheathed it. "And if that recommendation isn't accepted," he said, "then I'll pursue you again," Ryukin said, with the same even tone. "And we'll have this conversation from different positions." He met Zoro's eyes. "But I think the recommendation will be accepted. I've never filed one before." Something passed between them that wasn't exactly respect. It was more like the mutual recognition of two things that occupied the same tier of the world, each seeing the other with the specific clarity that only that tier allows. "Then we're done here," Zoro said. "For now," Ryukin said. Zoro went back across the water the way he'd come, not quite swimming, something between swimming and moving through water the way he moved through air, the Sunny's hull rising on his left as he came alongside, and he went up the anchor chain and landed on the deck dripping and silent. The crew was in various states of battled dishevelment, and was staring at him. "Well?" Nami said. "We're clear," Zoro said. "You convinced the Admiral?" she said. "I gave him information and let him make a decision." Sanji was looking at him with both eyebrows raised. "You had a conversation with the Admiral?" "Yes." "During a fight?" "After the fight." He picked up a towel that was hanging on the mast. "He's smart. Smart people respond to information." Nami stared at him. "Did you just? Are you telling me you talked us out of a confrontation with an Emperor Killer Admiral using an argument?" "And a sword at his throat," Robin added pleasantly from her chair. She had apparently watched the entire thing from the deck. The two together were the argument. Usopp made a sound like a balloon deflating, which was his body releasing the last 2 days of accumulated tension. He sat down on the deck with his back against the mast and looked at the sky. "Okay," he said. "Okay. We're alive and we're clear and that's okay." "Everyone in one piece?" Zoro asked. "A round of confirmation, yes, mostly, minor things, nothing Chopper couldn't handle." The Sunny had taken hull scarring from 2 cannon shots, but Frankie had already assessed it as cosmetic. The fleet behind them was pulling back, the white hulls turning, the formation breaking apart into individual ships heading back the way they'd come. Ryukin's command ship was the last to turn. It sat at the edge of engagement range for a long moment, and Zoro stood at the Sunny's stern and looked at it, and he had the sense that on that ship there was a careful pale-eyed man looking back, filing something away, updating a worldview that had been static for 20 years. Then the command ship turned and sailed away. Sanji came to stand beside him. He had a cigarette, naturally. "He'll come back," he said. "Maybe." "What did you actually say to him? About the One Piece?" Zoro was quiet for a moment. He thought about Ryukin's careful words. Information, not treasure, leverage over the entire world. And he thought about Robin, who was sitting in her chair with a book, and who had been waiting her entire life to find out what waited at Laugh Tale, and who deserved to find out. "I told him the truth," Zoro said. "That you're the right hands?" "Yes." Sanji dragged on his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "You believe that?" "Yes." "Not because you're the most powerful thing out here. Not because you're king of the pirates." "No." Sanji looked at him sideways. "Because of the crew." It wasn't a question. Zoro didn't answer it as one. He just looked at the horizon where the fleet was disappearing and he felt very clearly and completely, the weight of what he was carrying. Not as a burden. As a fact. As the most important fact about him. Not the swords. Not the bounty. Not the hat. The 8 people on this ship, and what they were all moving toward together. The One Piece is real, Robin said from behind them. Neither of them had heard her stand up. She was looking at the horizon where Ryukin's fleet had been, her book closed in her hands. Whatever it is, treasure or information or something else entirely, it's real and it's at Laugh Tale and we're close. How close? Zoro asked. She was quiet for a moment. Close enough that an admiral was willing to call it a draw today rather than risk the crew getting there under duress with nothing to lose. She looked at Zoro. He wasn't protecting the world government's interests just now. He was protecting the One Piece from falling to someone desperate. Zoro thought about that. What do you think it is? He asked her. She looked at the sea. For a long moment, she was quiet in the way that means the answer is large. I think it is the history of 100 years, she said finally. I think it is a record of what the world government buried. And I think that whoever holds that record can choose what to do with it, weaponize it or illuminate it. She looked at him. That is the choice at the end of this road. The sea moved around them. Below, Chopper was moving through the crew with his medical bag, addressing the collection of bruises and minor injuries that were the tax on a successful engagement. Usopp had started talking, which meant the storytelling instinct had asserted itself over the adrenaline. Frankie was below checking on the hull with the thorough satisfaction of an engineer who has been proven right about his own workmanship. Brook was playing something soft and wandering on his violin, music that seemed to come from nowhere in particular, and go nowhere in particular, and was exactly right for the moment. Nami looked up from her charts and found Zoro at the stern. Next course? Laugh Tale, he said. We don't have the exact coordinates. We have the giant compass. We have your charts. We have Robin's research. He looked at her. And we have the poneglyphs. Robin's head came up. All 4 road poneglyphs, Zoro said. Robin has the rubbings and the translations. We have everything we need. He looked around the deck, at everyone who was present, alive, battered and functional and moving forward. Plot the course. Nami stared at him for a moment. Then she went below. She came back 20 minutes later with charts and the giant compass and Robin's translated poneglyph notes, and she stood at the navigation table and worked, and the crew gathered around in 1s and 2s, and the work was quiet and concentrated and punctuated by the occasional question and the occasional soft exchange, and after an hour Nami looked up with something on her face that was past excitement, something deeper. Something that had been building for years and was now arriving at its moment. I've got it, she said. The table was completely still. Laugh Tale, she said. I know exactly where it is. It's... She paused, and pressed her hand flat against the chart, and breathed out slowly. It's closer than I thought. Much closer. We can be there in 4 days if the weather holds. 4 days. The number settled over the crew like something physical. Chopper made a sound. Usopp put his hand over his mouth. Frankie did cry, loudly and without embarrassment, and then said super several times in a row in a voice that was doing double duty as celebration and structural support. Sanji said nothing. He stood at the edge of the table and looked at the chart where Nami's finger rested, and his face was doing something that it usually kept private, something that had Luffy's name in it, and all blue and every version of the dream that had ever motivated him. And Zoro looked at that for a moment, and then looked away, giving him the same private space he'd given Usopp on Elbaf. Brook played 3 notes on his violin, very softly. Just 3. Then he stopped. Robin looked at the chart, and then at Zoro. He held her gaze. She nodded, very slightly, and something passed between them that was not a word but was more complete than most words, an acknowledgement, a recognition, a shared understanding that the road they had been walking was about to end and that the ending was worth all of it. Every inch of it. Zoro pulled the straw hat off his head and set it on the navigation table, flat, beside the chart that showed the location of Laugh Tale. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up and put it back on. 4 days, he said. Chapter 5, The Last Sea. The 4 days began quietly, which Zoro didn't trust. The new world had a particular sense of humor about quiet. It offered it the way a card player offers a comfortable chair, as a prelude to something that required you to be off your guard. He stayed sharp. He watched the horizon. He ran his katas before dawn every morning and after dinner every evening, and the crew orbited around this the way they'd always orbited around things that were essentially true about the people they sailed with. On the first day, Robin came to him with a question. She found him at the stern in the early afternoon, the sea trailing behind the sunny in 2 white lines of wake, the sky a high clean blue that suggested weather systems were minding their business for once. She sat beside him on the stern rail with her legs crossed and her book closed on her knee, which meant the book was a formality, and what she actually wanted was a conversation. "The road poneglyphs," she said. "What about them? I've been thinking about what they contain beyond the coordinates." She looked at the wake. "The red poneglyphs tell you where to go. But the content around the coordinates, the text that isn't the location itself, it's a record. Fragments of the void century. Things that the world government spent an enormous amount of energy making sure nobody could read." She paused. "At Laugh Tale, there will be the final poneglyph. The one that completes the record." "And the One Piece," Zoro said. "And the One Piece." She was quiet for a moment. "I need you to understand that when we get there, whatever I find, whatever the void century actually contains, it's going to be significant. It may be the kind of significant that has consequences." Zoro looked at her. "You've been waiting your whole life for it." "Yes." "Then read it," he said simply. "Whatever it says. You've earned the right to know it, and we've earned the right to be standing there when you do." Robin was quiet for long enough that he thought she might be done. Then she said very quietly, "I spent a long time believing I was the only one who would ever care about this. About what really happened. About the truth." She turned the closed book over in her hands. "And then I found people who—" She stopped. "Who'd fight an admiral so you could get there," Zoro said. She looked at him. Her eyes were steady and dark and full of something she managed with complete composure except at the very edges, where it pressed against the composure the way deep water presses against glass. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." He looked back at the sea. "Stop worrying about what you'll find. Start thinking about what you'll do with it. That's the part that matters." She was quiet for a moment. Then she made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh but came from the same place. "You're better at this than you think." "At what?" "At the human parts. Don't tell anyone," he said. She smiled, fully, genuinely, the kind that reached her eyes, and opened her book and went back to reading, and he went back to watching the horizon, and the sunny moved through the afternoon with everything it was carrying and everything it was heading toward. On the second day, it was Usopp. He showed up at the crow's nest with 2 cups of coffee at an hour that suggested he'd been awake thinking for a while, and he handed Zoro one and sat down with the air of someone who had decided to have a conversation and was going to follow through. "Can I ask you something?" Usopp said. "You're going to anyway." "Yeah, true." He held his cup with both hands. "When we get there, to Laugh Tale, and we find the One Piece, whatever it is, what happens after?" Zoro looked at him. "After? Like after? You're king of the pirates. That's the title, right? That's the thing that happens when you reach Laugh Tale and claim the One Piece. But then what? Does the crew, do we just—" He struggled for a moment with the shape of the question. "Luffy always said he'd be free. Like, being king of the pirates meant freedom. Total freedom. But that was Luffy's version. What's yours?" The question settled over Zoro and he turned it over in his mind honestly, giving it the weight it deserved. "The title changes what other people think," he said finally. "Doesn't change what I do. I still become the world's greatest swordsman. That's not finished just because we reach Laugh Tale." He paused. and you still become whatever it is you're going to become. The title doesn't end the crew. Usopp stared at him. You want to keep sailing. I want to finish what I started. Both things. So we just keep going? After reaching Laugh Tale, after the One Piece, did Luffy ever suggest we'd stop? Zoro said. A pause. No, Usopp said, and then laughed, and the laugh was complicated, grief and recognition and the particular relief of realizing that the most important things hadn't changed. No, he never said that. Then nothing's changed. He drank his coffee. The sea doesn't end at Laugh Tale. Neither do we. Usopp sat with this for a moment. His expression went through several iterations and settled on something that looked like decision, the internal kind, quiet and complete. I'm going to tell my father, he said. When this is over. I'm going to find the red-hair pirates, and I'm going to tell Yasopp that his son made it. He looked at the horizon. And then I'm going to come back and sail with you and that'll be fine. Zoro nodded once. That's fine. You're sure you won't get lost without a competent sniper? I'll wait for you. You'll be in the completely wrong ocean. Then you'll find me there. Usopp looked at him sideways. Was that a joke? No. It sounded like a joke. It was a statement of confidence in your navigation ability relative to mine. He finished his coffee. Take it how you want. Usopp laughed again, easier this time, and they sat in the crow's nest and watched the second day of the final stretch pass beneath them. On the third day, the weather broke. Not the catastrophic new world weather they'd already survived, not a storm system, or a lightning wall, or anything with a navigational solution. This was fog. Dense, warm, white fog that came in from the north before dawn and settled over the water with the complete indifference of something that had been here long before ships and would be here long after them. The Sunny moved into it at full sail, and the world became a sphere of white visibility about 30 meters in every direction. Nami cut their speed and came to the helm with her climatact fully extended, reading the air around them with the focused attention she gave to weather that didn't have an obvious explanation. It's not natural, she said, after 20 minutes. No, Robin agreed, from where she was sitting. She had been below before the fog arrived and had come up almost immediately, drawn by something Zoro hadn't consciously registered yet. She was looking at the fog with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, not alarmed, not analytical. Something closer to recognition. No, it isn't. Robin, Zoro said. The final stretch, she said quietly. The records I've read, the fragments from the ancient texts, they all mention this. The sea near Laugh Tale isn't like other seas. The island protects itself. The fog is part of that. The island is doing this? Nami said. Not consciously. It's a natural phenomenon built by something that was put there long ago, possibly specifically to. She paused. To make sure that only people who know what they're looking for can find it. People who can read the sea correctly. Can we read it correctly? Frankie asked. Nami can, Robin said, with a certainty that made Nami stand slightly straighter. The giant compass will help. But the navigator has to be good enough to read the magnetic variance under the fog's interference. She looked at Nami. You are that good. Nami looked at the fog. At her climatact. At the giant compass mounted beside the helm, its needle moving in slow arcs that didn't correspond to any standard magnetic heading. Okay, she said. Everyone off the deck except for whoever I need. What do you need? Zoro asked. Quiet. She looked at him. And you at the prow. If something comes out of that fog, I need to know immediately. He went to the prow. The fog was extraordinary. It had weight in it, not Ryuken's ability, not any supernatural application, just the physical density of moisture and warmth, and something else, something older, the way certain places in the world carry the weight of their own significance in the air. He stood with his hand on his sword hilts and his eyes working the white nothing ahead of them, and he felt the sunny adjust course beneath him, small corrections, Nami reading the giant compass and the climatact and the feel of the wind simultaneously, and doing what she did. Sanji appeared beside him after 20 minutes with a sandwich, which he ate standing without taking his eyes off the fog. "Did you sleep?" Sanji said. "4 hours. That's what you said last time. Last time it was true. This time it's also true." Sanji looked at the fog. "We're close." "Yes. I can feel it." That sounds ridiculous." "It doesn't," Zoro said. Sanji was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about all blue," he said. "The thing I've been sailing toward. And I know we're not going to find it at Laugh Tale specifically, that's not." He paused. "It's more that getting to Laugh Tale means the sea is real. All of it. All the impossible things we've been chasing, they're real. Which means all blue is real." He looked at the fog. "Stupid, but that's the thought." "Not stupid," Zoro said. "You'd say that about anything if it meant I kept cooking. You'd keep cooking regardless." Sanji considered this. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I would." He looked at the fog for another moment. "You know what Luffy would be doing right now if he were here? Running around the deck shouting about adventure," Zoro said. "Asking Nami if they were there yet every 5 minutes. Trying to eat the fog." Sanji laughed quietly, and the sound of it, genuinely warm, unguarded in the way that Sanji very rarely was, moved through the white air and disappeared. Then the laughter faded and what remained wasn't grief exactly, just the clean, clear shape of missing someone. The kind of missing that has accepted its own permanence and stopped fighting it. "He'd be so happy right now," Sanji said. "I know," Zoro said. They stood in silence in the fog, and the sunny moved forward under Nami's hands, and the magnetic variance on the giant compass made its slow arcs, and the fog pressed in around them with all its ancient patient density, and Zoro thought about Luffy, not with grief but with something more like gratitude, the specific gratitude you feel for someone who pointed you at the right horizon even if they couldn't be there when you reached it. On the afternoon of the third day, the fog began to thin. It happened gradually, not burning off the way morning fog burns off, but receding, as though it were being withdrawn rather than dissipated. The visibility extended to 50 meters, then 100, then further, the white thinning to gray and the gray thinning to the gold of late afternoon light finding its way through, and through the thinning Nami navigated with the same concentrated precision she'd maintained for 12 hours without a break. Chopper brought her food at regular intervals. She ate without looking at the plate. The fog cleared entirely at approximately 4 in the afternoon. And there was an island. Not a dramatic island, not a volcanic formation or a towering cliff face or anything designed to communicate importance to the eye. Just an island. Green and quiet, moderate in scale, the kind of place you might sail past without registering it as anything in particular. A curved beach of pale sand, a tree line of dense green above it, hills rolling back from the coast to a moderate central height. The sky above it was clear and the light on it was ordinary, and everything about its appearance was the opposite of what the imagination constructs when it has been building towards something for a long time. This was Laugh Tale. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Chopper said very softly, "Is that yes?" Robin said. The word landed on the deck and the crew absorbed it separately and together, each person carrying their own version of what this moment meant, and the versions were all different and all the same. Nami's hands were on the wheel and she was looking at the island with an expression that had years in it, years of charts and navigation, and the sea used as a road towards something she'd been told was unreachable. Frankie was making a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't language. Brooks stood with both hands on the rail and his jaw, well, what served as his jaw, slightly lowered, which for a skeleton was the equivalent of an open-mouthed stare. Usopp sat down on the deck very suddenly, as though his legs had made a unilateral decision. Sanji was completely still, which was rare enough to be remarkable. Zoro looked at the island. He looked at it for a long time, letting the fact of it arrive completely, and when it had arrived he turned and looked at the crew, at each of them, one at a time, taking inventory of who they were and what they were carrying and what it had cost to get to this particular deck at this particular moment. "Let's go," he said. The Sunny moored in the natural harbor on the island's east side, where the sand gave way to a shallow stone shelf perfect for anchoring, and they went ashore in the small boat and pulled it up above the waterline and stood on the beach of Laugh Tale. The sand was warm. The island smelled like any island, green things and salt and something else, something faintly mineral that didn't have an easy comparison. The tree line was perhaps 100 meters up the beach, and the trees themselves were ordinary trees, not ancient monuments or mystical formations, just trees that had been growing in good soil without anyone to bother them. "It's quiet," Usopp said. "Yes," Robin said. She was already walking toward the tree line, not hurriedly but with direction, following something. Not a path exactly. A sense of the land's topology. The way certain places on islands draw things toward their center, the topographic pull of elevated ground. They followed her through the trees. The interior of the island opened after perhaps 10 minutes of walking into a broad natural clearing, and in the clearing was a stone. It wasn't a poneglyph. It was something older, a different material, a different shape, carved not in the cubic form of the poneglyphs but in an irregular mass that looked almost natural except for the text covering every surface of it, dense and deliberate, letters in the ancient script layered over each other in a way that suggested it had been added to over time, one generation leaving its record on top of the last. Around it, in a loose circle, were 4 objects that the crew processed at different speeds. A chest, very old, sea-stained, with a lock that had corroded completely open. A logbook, the ancient kind, the cover made from something that wasn't leather but had survived centuries without degrading. A flag, folded and tied with a strip of cloth that had faded to the same color as the sand on the beach. And a second chest, smaller than the first, sealed with a mechanism that was still functional. Robin walked to the great stone and placed her hand against it and read. The crew stood back. Not because they'd been asked to, nobody asked them to, but because this was Robin's moment in a way that was separate from the crew's collective moment, and they all understood that without needing to discuss it. She read for a long time, moving around the stone, tracing letters with her fingertips, her lips moving occasionally in that slight way they moved when she was processing text that required her full attention. Nobody spoke. The clearing was quiet. Birds in the trees. The distant sound of the sea. When Robin stopped reading, she stood with her back to the stone for a moment, facing the crew, and her expression had something in it that was past composure, not destroyed by what she'd read, but changed by it, the same way that anything that finally receives the thing it's been waiting for is changed. The waiting ends, and what you were before the waiting is never quite the same thing again. "Tell us," Zoro said. She breathed in once. "The Void Century was a war," she said. "Not the way history frames it, not a political conflict or a power struggle. A war over what the world would be. There were people, the ancient kingdom, who were building something. Not a weapon. A record system. A way to document everything about the world so that no single entity could control what was known and not known." She paused. "The 20 kingdoms that formed the world government destroyed the ancient kingdom because what it was building would have made them unable to maintain control. They erased it. They buried the 100 years. They created the poneglyphs as a controlled remnant, stone records that could survive but that they believed no one would ever be able to fully read." The clearing was absolutely still. "They underestimated O'Hara," she said quietly. "They underestimated my people." A beat. "What's in the chest?" Sanji said. "The One Piece," she said. "But not what anyone thought." She walked to the smaller sealed chest and examined the mechanism. "This seal responds to the poneglyph script. It requires the reader to enter the correct phrase from the Great Stone's inscription." She looked at Zoro. "The phrase is a question, actually. The inscription asks the person who arrives here, 'What did you come for?'" The crew absorbed this. "And the answer?" Robin said, "To no one in particular, is the last line of the ancient record." She touched the seal. "The answer is, to give it back." She entered the phrase. The mechanism clicked. The chest opened. Inside was not gold. Not a material treasure in any conventional sense. It was a collection of small black stones, dozens of them, each one covered in text, each one a miniaturized record using the same indestructible material as the poneglyphs. They were dense with writing. They were the complete, unabridged record of the Void Century, every detail, every name, every truth that the world government had spent 800 years trying to keep buried. The evidence of everything. The material that, in the right hands, could illuminate 100 years of buried truth and give the world the choice to know itself. Robin picked up one of the stones and held it. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her eyes were bright. "This is what Joy Boy left," she said. "Not for himself. Not for a king. For whoever came next. For whoever came with enough of the right things to find their way here." She looked at Zoro. For someone who understood that the point wasn't to possess this. The point was to know what to do with it. Zoro looked at the chest full of stones. He thought about Ryuken's words on the command ship, absolute leverage over the entire world. He thought about Robin's phrasing, weaponize it or illuminate it. He looked at the logbook. He picked it up and opened it. The first page was written in modern script, not ancient, not obscured, clearly legible, left by someone who had been here before and had taken the time to leave instructions. The handwriting was eccentric and sprawling, and the content was, "If you're reading this, you made it, which means the sea decided you were the right kind of idiot. This isn't yours to keep. It's yours to use, and there's a difference. The world needs to know what happened. Figure out how to tell it. That's the whole job. The treasure is the knowledge, and the knowledge is the choice. Good luck." There was a signature at the bottom. Zoro looked at it for a long moment. The name was one he recognized, not from his own experience but from the stories that moved through the pirate world, from the thing that Luffy had always said when anyone asked why he wanted to be king of the pirates. The name was the name of the man who had laughed at Laugh-Tale and taken the title, and then done something that the world government had spent 23 years trying to bury the specific details of. Roger had been here. Roger had sat in this clearing and read this stone, and opened this chest, and picked up this same logbook, and left this note for whoever came next. Zoro set the logbook down carefully. He looked at the crew. At the chest of stones. At Robin still holding the record in both hands. At the flag on the ground. He picked up the flag. He untied the strip of cloth. He unfolded it. It was a Jolly Roger, not the Straw Hats, not any crews he recognized. Older. The skull on it was drawn in a different style, something that predated the current pirate flag conventions, and the expression on the skull was not the standard grinning threat. It was laughing. Genuinely, completely laughing, the skull's carved jaw wide, the eye sockets crinkled in the way that eyes crinkle when laughter is real. The Roger Pirate's flag. Left here. For whoever came next. Zoro held it for a long moment. Then he folded it again carefully and tucked it under his arm. "The stones," he said to Robin. "How do we use them?" She looked at him. "We copy them. Every major island. Every newspaper. Every place where people gather information. We distribute the record so that no single force can suppress it, the same way the ancient kingdom intended to distribute it before it was destroyed." She paused. "It won't change everything immediately. It won't collapse the world government overnight. But it will mean that the truth exists in a form that can't be erased. Then that's what we do," he said. Nami was sitting on the stone beside the chest with her knees drawn up, looking at the clearing and the trees and the light coming through them. She looked like someone who had arrived at a place and was taking the full measure of having arrived, not disappointed, not overwhelmed, just present in it completely. "Luffy would have loved this," she said. "Not sad. Just honest. He would have eaten one of the stones," Usopp said. "Definitely," Chopper said. "He would have tried to befriend the island," Sanji said. "The island would have befriended him back," Brooks said. "Islands often did." The crew sat in the clearing at Laugh-Tale and let the laughter come, not forced, not overwrought, just the real kind, the kind that surfaces when people who have been through something enormous together are given a moment of relief and choose to fill it with the best thing available. Zoro didn't laugh, specifically, but he felt the particular warmth of it around him, the sound of the people he was responsible for being genuinely, freely happy for the first time since Wano, and the warmth of it moved through him the way warmth moves through something that has been cold for a long time, slowly, from the outside in, taking its time, finding the deep places. After a while, when the laughter had settled into comfortable quiet, Robin began the work of documenting the stones. She had the tools for this, she'd been carrying them since before Wano, a scholar's kit assembled over years of preparation for exactly this purpose. Paper made from the same preserved materials as the logbook, ink that wouldn't fade, a copying technique that she worked with an efficiency born of lifelong practice. She worked in the afternoon light and the crew came and went around her, exploring the clearing and the island's immediate vicinity. Frankie found a freshwater stream 50 meters into the trees and reported it with the enthusiasm of an engineer who has located a practical resource. Chopper found several medicinal plants that he didn't recognize and spent 20 minutes in intense professional excitement. Brooke found a stone formation near the island's center that produced a particular acoustic when the wind moved through it, a low, harmonic sound that had probably been contributing to the island's aura for centuries, a natural instrument played by geography. He sat near it and listened with his skull tilted to one side and said nothing for a long time. Usopp climbed a tree. Sanji made tea from the freshwater stream using ingredients from his kit, and brought cups to everyone in the clearing with the specific care that characterized his best version of himself, the one that emerged when performance became unnecessary, and what remained was simply the genuine thing underneath. He handed Zoro a cup last. "Sit down," Sanji said. Zoro looked at him. "You've been standing since we landed. Sit down. Everything's fine." Zoro sat on the ground beside Robin's work and drank his tea and looked at the clearing, at the great stone with its centuries of truth, at the open chest, at Robin copying records in the last good light of the afternoon. He had reached Laugh Tale. He was sitting on the ground of it, and the ground was just ground, and the trees were just trees, and the island was just an island, and the thing that had been at the end of the road his whole life was not a place but a fact, the fact of being here, of having carried everyone here, of having been the person this required him to be. He took the straw hat off his head. He set it on the ground in front of him and looked at it. The worn brim. The faded straw. The particular shape of something that had been worn by a person with a specific head and a specific way of sitting and a specific tendency to tilt it back when he was laughing hard. Zoro pressed his palm flat against the crown of the hat. Held it there. "We're here," he said, quietly. To no one visible. "We're all here." The clearing held the sound and let it go. Robin glanced at him over her work and then looked back at her copying without saying anything, which was the exact right response, and he picked the hat back up and put it on and drank the rest of his tea. As the light began to fail, Nami spread her charts on the ground and started calculating. "We need to think about the distribution," she said. "The best coverage. Robin, how many copies can you make?" "Enough for 40 locations, with what I brought." Robin didn't look up from her work. "More with the right materials on the next island. 40 locations minimum. We need to hit the major newspaper hubs and the places with the biggest reach. Fusha Village. Low Town. The major islands in the first half of the Grand Line. The free ports." She was drawing lines on her chart. "If we do this right, the information can't be suppressed. It's too distributed. The world government will know immediately." Sanji said. "Yes," Robin said. "That's the point. They'll come for us. They've always been coming for us," Zoro said. "Nothing changes about that. The Admiral will make a decision," Zoro said. "The same one he made before. Whether to pursue something that the whole world is now going to know about, or whether to look at the information and make a different calculation." He paused. "Ryukin is smart. Smart people update." Nami looked at her chart. "So we distribute, we sail, and we deal with whatever comes." "Yes." And Laugh Tale. She looked at the clearing, the stone, the chest. "We leave this here?" "The chest stays," Zoro said. The record stays. Robin has the copies. Anyone who makes it here after us finds what Roger found, and what we found, and reads the same note. He looked at the logbook. It's not a treasure that belongs to one crew. That's the point of it. Nami absorbed this. Looked at the logbook. Looked at Zoro. Roger understood that, she said. Roger understood everything at the end, Robin said quietly, still writing. That's what Laugh-Tale does. You arrive with your questions and you find out they were always the right questions. You just needed to get here to understand the answers. The stars were coming out by the time Robin finished her first set of copies. They built a small fire from the island's fallen wood. It burned a specific warm gold, the kind that comes from particular resin in trees that grow in isolation, and they ate the meals Sanji prepared from the supplies they brought ashore, and the meal was excellent because Sanji's meals were always excellent, and because the ingredients of the occasion had a flavor that no amount of skill could entirely account for. They were at Laugh-Tale, sitting around a fire, and they were alive. Brook played. He played for a long time, not one continuous piece but a collection of things, moving through moods the way an evening moves through lights, and the music moved through the clearing and up into the trees and out toward the sea, and the sea was dark and full and patient around the island. At one point he played something that nobody asked him to name, and nobody needed to. Everyone knew what it was. It was the kind of music that sounds like a person laughing, a specific person, a specific laugh, the kind that started quiet and built until it filled every available space and made you feel, regardless of your own emotional circumstances, that the world was larger and more interesting than you'd previously accounted for. Zoro sat with his back against the great stone, and his swords across his knees and the straw hat on his head, and let the music happen around him. He thought about Mihawk. He thought about the battle that was still waiting, the one that would complete his original promise, the one that had started with a boy in a village making a declaration to a dead girl in front of a shrine and had been building toward its conclusion ever since. It was still there, still waiting, and the fact of being at Laugh-Tale didn't diminish it. If anything, it was clearer now. Lighter. He was going to find Mihawk. He was going to fight him at full strength, not as the swordsman he'd been in Wano, not as the swordsman he'd been before the Admiral, but as whatever he was becoming, the thing that was still building itself from all the pieces of the journey, and he was going to win. And then he was going to be both things. King and greatest swordsman. Both. Because Luffy had believed you could want everything. That the wanting wasn't greed, it was aliveness. He pressed the back of his hand against the stone behind him and felt the ancient text under his knuckles, and he thought, we made it. He thought, we're not done. He thought, good. The fire burned lower and the stars rotated above the clearing in their slow arc, and the crew of the Thousand Sunny slept on the ground of Laugh-Tale with the sound of the sea at the edge of everything, and the island held them, and the night was warm, and whatever came next was going to require everything they had. They had everything they had. That had always been enough. Chapter 6, King. They left Laugh-Tale at dawn. Not because there was a reason to hurry. The urgency was different now, not the urgency of pursuit or deadline but the urgency of purpose, the specific forward momentum of people who know what they're doing and why. Robin had finished her copies through the night, working by firelight with the steady concentration of someone completing the most important work of their life. When the first light came over the tree line, she sealed the last envelope and placed it in the waterproof case she'd prepared and looked up at the clearing one final time. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Zoro secured the Roger Pirate's flag inside his coat before they left the clearing. He didn't tell anyone he was doing it. Nobody asked? Some things belong to the doing rather than the discussing. The Sunny waited in the harbor exactly as they'd left her, patient and intact, and they loaded the small boat and rowed back to her in the early quiet and climbed aboard, and Frankie had the engines running before the last person cleared the rail. The anchor came up. The sails went out. The island began to shrink behind them, receding the way significant things recede, slowly, then all at once. Nami was already plotting. First stop is Logue Town, she said without preamble. It's the most significant newspaper distribution point in the first half of the Grand Line, and it has personal significance for the announcement. She paused. Roger was executed there. The world found out about the One Piece there. It's the right place to distribute the first copy of the Void Century record. Symbolically, Usopp said. Symbolically and practically. The Lobetown paper goes to every major island within 3 days. If we release there first, the secondary distribution is automatic. And the world government will know within 24 hours that something has been released. Sanji said. Yes. Which means we're starting a clock the moment we hand over the first copy. We've been living on clocks since Wano. Zoro said from the helm, where he'd taken the wheel from Nami while she worked. Nothing changes. Sanji looked at him at the helm and made the compressed sound of reluctant agreement. The first 2 days back through the New World were fast and uneventful. The weather cooperated, the sea remained the quiet, slightly suspicious calm of a route they'd already traveled, and the crew used the time to prepare. Robin organized the copies into a sequence with annotations explaining the context and significance of each section, making the record as accessible as possible for people without her specific expertise. Usopp produced a series of illustrated broadsheets, his artistic skill deployed with genuine force, pages that combined Robin's text with visual evidence that anyone could understand regardless of their literacy in ancient scripts. Sanji called it propaganda. Robin called it journalism. Zoro called it necessary. Usopp called it the best work he'd ever done, which was probably true. On the third day out from Laugh Tale, the Den Den Mushi rang. Zoro answered it himself this time, which surprised Robin, who was nearest to the receiver. He picked it up and held it to his ear and said nothing, waiting. The voice on the other end was one he didn't recognize, clipped, marine cadence, neither hostile nor warm. It said, Roronoa Zoro. Admiral Ryukin requests a private communication channel. Zoro looked at Robin. She nodded slightly, 1 degree of inclination, which meant she thought he should take it. Patch him through, Zoro said. A brief static interval, and then Ryukin's voice, the same as it had been on his command ship, even and precise. You reached Laugh Tale? Yes. And the One Piece? Yes. A pause. My intelligence tells me you're moving toward Lobetown with materials of significant informational content. Your intelligence is good. It's functional. Another pause, longer than the first. I spent last night reading a document that someone left under my cabin door. Someone who was on my ship during our engagement and had access to my office. Zoro said nothing. The document was a fragment. A partial translation of what I presume is a portion of the Void Century record. Ryukin's voice was unchanged in its quality, but something under it had shifted, some foundation that had been fixed for 20 years showing the first evidence of movement. If what this document contains is accurate, it's accurate, Zoro said. A longer silence. Then the mandate I've been executing, Ryukin said, has been protecting an institution that... He stopped. He actually stopped, which from a man of that particular composure was not a small thing. I need time. I know, Zoro said. I'm not going to pursue the Straw Hat crew at this time, Ryukin said. I'm filing the formal recommendation I mentioned during our engagement. What happens after that is above my rank. He paused. But I want you to know, whatever the world government decides to do about what you release in Lobetown, the order to pursue you will not come from me. Zoro held the receiver and thought about this man, this precise, methodical, 20-year believer whose certainty was currently undergoing something that had to be experienced rather than described. Ryukin, he said. Yes. What you do with what you know, that's yours. I'm not going to tell you how to handle it. But the record is going out regardless of what anyone decides above your rank. It's going out because the world deserves to know it. A pause. I understand that, Ryukin said. I don't agree with the method. But I understand the reason. Another pause. Good luck, Emperor. The line closed. Zoro set the receiver down. He won't pursue us, Robin said. Not a question. Not immediately. Zoro looked at the horizon. He's going to have to decide what he is. That takes time. Some people never decide. She said. He will. Zoro said. He's that kind of man. He won't stay undecided for long. She looked at him. How do you know? Because undecided is uncomfortable for someone like him. He'll make a choice. I think it'll be a good one. He paused. But either way, we move. They reached the entrance to the first half of the Grand Line, the point where the new world ended and the familiar chaos of the route to the Grand Line's beginning started, on the fifth day, and the transition was marked by the specific shift in weather and current that the Grand Line always announced itself with, the sea becoming more itself, more unpredictable, more vibrantly alive in all the ways that made it terrible and magnificent. It felt like coming home. Not home in the domestic sense. The Sunny was home, and home was wherever the crew was and the sea was under them. But the familiarity of it, the known quality of this particular chaos, landed in a way that moved through all of them simultaneously, visible in the slight adjustments of posture and expression that people make when they enter familiar territory. Chopper said it out loud, because Chopper often said out loud the thing everyone else was feeling internally. It feels like home, he said from the rail, looking at the turbulent water ahead. Nobody contradicted him. Logue Town came into view on the seventh day out of Laugh Tale, and the sight of it carried its own specific weight. The town was as it had always been, the harbor, the execution platform in the central square, the particular dense energy of a place that sat at the edge of one of the world's great thresholds, and had absorbed the characters of everyone who had passed through it across centuries. People arrived here full of ambition and people left here either larger or finished. The scaffold in the square had seen both kinds. Roger had stood there and said something. Luffy had stood there, and something almost happened. Now the Straw Hat crew was tying up in the harbor for the second time, and the context of their arrival had changed substantially. They'll know who we are, Nami said, watching the dockside. Yes, Zoro said. The bounty posters have been updated. Your face is on every flat surface in this town and in 17 surrounding islands. I know. And you want to walk into the newspaper office and hand them the most politically explosive document in 800 years of recorded history and just, yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her climate baton. Okay, she said. Then I'm coming. So am I, Sanji said. All of us, Usopp said from where he was already tying his bag closed. Obviously, Brooks said. Frankie raised both metal arms. Super obviously. Chopper had already transformed to his walking form and was putting on his hat. Robin was carrying the case of documents under one arm and a book under the other, because she was Robin. They walked into Logue Town together. The reaction was not immediate. It took the town about 30 seconds to process what was walking down the main street, the way crowds always take a moment to bridge the gap between information known intellectually and reality perceived directly. Then it happened all at once, the way things happen in port towns where news travels at the speed of human excitement. Heads turning, voices dropping and then rising, a ripple moving outward from their position like a stone dropped in still water. Straw Hats. The Emperor. Roronoa Zoro. He walked through it without adjusting his pace or his expression. The straw hat on his head caught the morning sun and was what it was, worn and irreplaceable and completely visible, and he let it be seen because there was no purpose in hiding it, and he had never been constitutionally suited to hiding anything. The newspaper office was on the main street, as it had always been, the kind of institution that Logue Town had grown around rather than built deliberately. It had been there long enough that the town shaped itself to accommodate it rather than the other way around. The editor was a heavy-set woman in her 60s with ink-stained hands and the eyes of someone who had seen enough history walk through her door that she had developed a genuinely calibrated response to remarkable things. She looked at Zoro. At the crew. At Robin's case. Roronoa Zoro, she said. Yes, he said. The Emperor. She looked at him with those calibrated eyes. You reached Laugh Tale. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The whole world wants to know what you found. That's why we're here. He looked at Robin. Robin stepped forward and placed the case on the counter between them and opened it. She removed the first and most complete document, the one she'd spent the most time on, the one that was most carefully organized for comprehension and impact, and laid it on the counter. The editor looked at it. She looked at it for a long time without picking it up. "What is this?" she said. "The Void Century," Robin said. "The complete record. What happened during the 100 years that the world government erased from history." The editor's hand moved to the document and stopped. "If I print this, the world government will be extremely unhappy," Robin said. "Yes. They'll shut down this paper." "They'll try," Zoro said. The editor looked at him. "The same document is going to 40 other locations," he said. 40 newspapers, 40 distribution points, across both halves of the Grand Line. If it's in 40 places, it can't be suppressed by shutting down 1. Or 10. He met her eyes steadily. "The only thing that gets suppressed is the truth if you decide not to print it." The editor looked at the document. She looked at Zoro. She looked at Robin, who stood with the complete composure of someone who had been waiting her whole life to do this, and was doing it now, and was not going to stop. The editor picked up the document. "I'll need a day to typeset this," she said. "You have it," Zoro said. "And if the Marines come before the paper goes out, tell them Roronoa Zoro said to wait," he said. "If they still come, call for us." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned and walked into the back of the office and began to work, and the door swung shut behind her, and that was that. Outside, the crew regrouped on the main street, and Nami was already organizing the distribution. She had a list, she had routes, she had the particular focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a moment to apply her organizational intelligence at full capacity, and was now doing exactly that. Robin would take the sea route to the northern distribution points. Sanji had contacts from his old network who could move documents through 3 of the remaining territories without marine interception. Usopp's broadsheets would go by a different route entirely. The pirate network passed hand to hand, the kind of distribution that moved fastest in the places the world government was least able to monitor. It was a good plan. It was executed over the next 3 days in Logue Town while the Sunny sat in harbor and Frankie made minor repairs and Chopper replenished medical supplies and Brook played on the execution platform in the central square every evening to a crowd that grew each night, and was, by the 3rd evening, large enough to constitute most of the town's population. He played the music that felt right. The music that sounded like someone laughing. It was on the 3rd evening, while Brook played and the crowd listened, and the first printed copies of the Void Century record were already moving through the mail routes, and the pirate networks, and the sea lanes toward their 40 destinations, that Zoro felt the presence. He was standing at the edge of the square with his back against a wall and his arms crossed, watching the crowd, and the feeling arrived the way important things arrived for him, not dramatically, not with any external signal, just a sudden clarity of awareness, a specific quality of attention drawn in a specific direction. He turned. Mihawk was standing at the far edge of the square. He was alone. No ship visible, no retinue, just the man himself, in his coat, with his cross-shaped sword at his back, looking at Zoro across the crowd with those amber eyes that had been watching him since before he was worth watching. The crowd was between them. Brook was still playing. The music was warm and full and completely oblivious to the specific configuration of 2 swordsmen at opposite edges of a square, caught in the orbit of the thing that had been building between them for years. Zoro straightened off the wall. He crossed the square. The crowd parted without being asked. People moved instinctively when Zoro moved with purpose, some animal awareness of force and motion causing the path to clear ahead of him. He stopped 6 feet from Mihawk and they looked at each other, and the looking contained everything that neither of them was going to say out loud. "You found it," Mihawk said. "Yes," laughed Tail. "Yes." Mihawk looked at him, at the swords, at the straw hat, at the specific bearing of the person standing in front of him, which had always been notable, and was now something more than notable. His expression was its usual composition of contained attention and the complete absence of anything performative, but underneath the usual composure there was something that Zoro had never seen on his face before. Satisfaction. Not pride exactly, something more internal than pride. The satisfaction of a patient thing that has been watching a long development reach its correct conclusion. "You came to find me," Zoro said. "I came to Logue Town because the newspaper here will print something interesting tomorrow morning," Mihawk said. "And because you would be here." He paused. "And because a conversation has been overdue for some time." "The fight," Zoro said. "Yes." The crowd around them had opened into a wider space now, people aware on some instinctive level that the specific energy between these two people required room. Brook had stopped playing, not because he'd been asked to but because he'd looked up and processed what he was seeing and made the quiet decision that silence was more appropriate. "Not here," Zoro said. "No," Mihawk agreed. "Not in a town square with an audience." His amber eyes moved briefly to the straw hat, and then back to Zoro's face. "You've changed. You told me to get stronger. I told you that you were still not at the level you needed to be." "I know." Mihawk looked at him steadily. "I've been watching from a distance since Wano. The engagement with the Sea Kings in the storm. The confrontation with Ryukin on his ship." He paused. "You disrupted an admiral's hockey-based ability through structural analysis during a fight." "Yes." "That is not something I taught you." "No," Zoro said. "I figured that one out." Something moved in Mihawk's expression, fast, controlled, but present. "Then you're ready," he said. Not as permission. Just as a statement of fact, the same flat certainty he used for everything. "Tomorrow," Zoro said. "Outside the town. I know a place." Mihawk nodded once and stepped back into the crowd and disappeared with the effortless invisibility of someone who has chosen not to be seen, and Zoro stood in the open space of the square with the absence of him and felt the specific electrical quality of something that had been approaching for his entire adult life now arriving at arm's reach. Tomorrow. He went back to the Sunny and the crew was there and Sanji was cooking and Nami was updating her charts and everything was ordinary in the way it always was on the ship, the domestic texture of people who lived together, and he sat down at the table and ate dinner and said nothing about what had happened in the square. Usopp looked at him across the table with the perceptiveness that he deployed inconsistently but absolutely when it mattered. "You've got that face," Usopp said. "What face?" "The I'm going to do something significant tomorrow and I'm currently being very calm about it face." Robin looked up from her book. Sanji stopped moving briefly in the kitchen. Zoro looked at Usopp. "Mihawk is in Logue Town." The table went completely still. "The fight," Nami said. Her voice was very controlled. "You're going to fight Mihawk. Tomorrow." "Zoro, Nami," he said. "This is what it's been for. All of it. Everything I've been training towards since I was a child making a promise in front of a shrine." He looked around the table, at each of them, steady, without performance. "This is mine. This is what I've been doing alongside everything else. It's time." The table held the silence for a moment. Then Sanji said from the kitchen, "Win." Just that. Not a question, not a qualification. Just a word, delivered with the flat confidence of someone who has made a decision about what they believe and is not interested in revisiting it. "Yes," Chopper said. "Super yes," Frankie said. "I would very much like to continue sailing with the world's greatest swordsman," Brooke said. "Yo-ho-ho." Robin looked at him across the table and her expression was the precise calibrated warmth of someone who understood all the layers of this and was holding them simultaneously. "You've been ready for this for a while," she said. "You've been making yourself ready for longer than ready required. The rest has been certainty." He held her gaze. "Yeah." She went back to her book. He slept that night for 7 hours, which was the most he'd slept since before Wano, and he woke at dawn completely present and dressed and picked up all 3 swords and went above deck. The morning was clear. The kind of morning that the Grand Line occasionally produced as though an apology for the rest of its behavior. Soft light, no wind yet, the harbor water as still as silver. Logue Town was just waking, the sounds of the town beginning to organize themselves, and somewhere in that town a newspaper press was running and the first copies of the Void Century record were coming off the rollers and into the hands of people who would have to decide what to do with the knowledge that the world was not the shape they'd been told. Mihawk was at the town's eastern edge, as agreed, in a clearing that opened into a rocky headland above the water. He was sitting on a stone when Zoro arrived. He stood when he saw Zoro coming, not out of ceremony but out of the particular alertness of a fighter reading the approach of another fighter. He was already holding his sword, not drawn, just in hand, the great black crossblade that was as much a fact about the world as gravity. Zoro stopped 10 meters from him. They looked at each other in the early light. Before this, Mihawk said. One thing. Zoro waited. When Dracula Mihawk trained Roronoa Zoro on Kurigana Island, he said, I told him that reaching the top required not just strength but the understanding of what strength was for. He paused. You've found that understanding. Is that why you're here? Zoro said. To tell me I've passed some test? No, Mihawk said. I'm here because this has been waiting and things that wait long enough become necessary. He met Zoro's eyes. I don't lose to tests. I lose to people who are genuinely better. I've never lost. He let that sit for a moment. I want to know if that changes today. It changes today, Zoro said. Mihawk looked at him for one more moment. Then he drew the blade. The morning light hit the black steel and swallowed it, the sword's surface consuming light rather than reflecting it, and Mihawk stood with it in the opening guard position that Zoro had studied from a distance for years and then from a closer distance on Kurigana and then in the architecture of his own technique, incorporating the principles of it. Learning the grammar of the greatest swordsmanship in the world by reading its source as closely as he was allowed. Zoro drew all three. Kitetsu in his right hand, humming its particular hum. Shusui in his left, the black blade with its weight and memory. Wado Ikimanji in his teeth, where it always went, the sword that had started everything, the sword that had belonged to Kuina, the sword that was his original promise made into metal and carried forward through every version of himself he'd been since he was 11 years old. He breathed. He moved. What happened in the next 30 minutes on the headland above Logue Town was not a performance. It was not a demonstration. It had no audience because Zoro had specifically chosen a place that had none, and that was correct. This was private in the way that all genuinely important things are private, intimate in the way of two forces that have been in conversation for years finally speaking directly. Mihawk was everything he'd always been. That had to be established first, had to be the ground that the fight was built on. He was the world's greatest swordsman, and he fought as that thing completely, without reservation or restraint, with the full application of 20+ years of being the absolute peak. His technique was not showy. It was perfect. There was no wasted movement, no excess force, no gap in his defense that was larger than the minimum required for offense. Fighting him was like fighting architecture, everything held. Zoro had been fighting architecture his whole life. He knew where the walls were. He knew where the weight was distributed. He knew now, after Elbaf, after Ryukin, after everything the journey had built into him, where the structural points were. Not weaknesses. Mihawk had no weaknesses. But points of maximum efficiency, angles of approach that were slightly more efficient than others, the specific geometry of a perfect style that was perfect in one way and not another. He was slower than Mihawk at the start. He accepted that. He worked within it the way he'd worked within Ryukin's weight, not fighting the constraint but using it, making the slowness into a structural element, a way of conserving and concentrating. When he moved fast, he moved faster than anything. The fight found its nature about 10 minutes in. Both of them passed the assessment phase, past the feeling out, into the genuine direct exchange where technique stopped being a conversation and became a confrontation. Mihawk's cuts were extraordinary, each one carrying an intent that went past the physical into something that communicated directly with Zoro's spatial sense, his reading of trajectories, his deep understanding of what steel wanted to do when directed by mastery. Zoro bled. Of course he bled. Mihawk was Mihawk. The cuts were precise and calibrated, not killing cuts, not yet, but real, the kind that registered in his body as genuine damage that required response. His shoulder, already the weakest point from Wano, took a cut that sang down to the joint. His left side opened along a line that he countered immediately, and managed but didn't eliminate. He kept moving. The thing about the Elbaf technique, the concentration of force into the smallest surface, was that it required complete physical commitment at the moment of application. Not strength, not power, but precision so absolute that it was nearly the same thing as surrender, the complete giving over of everything to a single point. He'd been building toward the moment when he could apply that principle at this level, with this opponent, and the building had taken everything the journey had given him and turned it into a single available action. He found the moment. It was the same kind of thing as finding the structural point in Ryuken's ability, not visible, but perceptible, a gap in the architecture of even perfect technique that existed not because the technique was flawed but because nothing that exists at the scale of human movement can exist without the specific gaps that human movement contains. Mihawk's opening was infinitesimally small. It existed for less than a second. Zoro cut through it with everything he had. The force of the exchange sent both of them back, Zoro 3 steps, Mihawk 2. Mihawk's coat was cut along the left shoulder. The cut was deep enough to matter. Mihawk looked at the cut. He looked at Zoro. Zoro was breathing hard, both hands on his swords, the third in his teeth. His shoulder was bleeding through the bandaging. His left side was hot and wet. He was standing completely upright. The silence on the headland lasted several seconds. Mihawk lowered his sword. Not in defeat, not in the performative way, not with surrender in it. He lowered it in the precise, specific way of a person making an acknowledgement that they've arrived at through direct evidence, and are making without reservation. "You're there," he said. Zoro held his swords. "The title," Mihawk said. "World's greatest swordsman. It belongs to the person who can do what you just did, cut through the technique of the previous holder." He met Zoro's eyes. "It's yours." The morning light was full now, the sun up and the headland lit in the clean gold of a day that had decided to be beautiful, and Zoro stood in it with 3 swords and blood on his coat and the straw hat on his head, and he felt the thing he'd been walking toward his whole life arrive completely, settle into him completely, become the fact it had always been going to be. He was both things. King of the pirates and world's greatest swordsman. Both, simultaneously, without conflict, because they had never been in conflict, had always been the same impulse expressed in 2 different directions, the same fundamental truth about who Roronoa Zoro was and had always been. He was someone who reached the top of whatever he pointed himself at. He sheathed his swords. "Thank you," he said. "To Mihawk. For the training, for the watching, for the patience of a man who had held the title for decades and had recognized the person who would take it, and had not run from that recognition." Mihawk looked at him for one last moment. "Don't waste it," he said, and walked away along the headland with his coat open at the shoulder, and his sword at his back, and Zoro watched him go until he was gone. Then he sat down on the rock that Mihawk had been sitting on when he arrived. He sat there for a while in the morning light with his hands on his knees and his wounds aching and the sound of the sea below the headland and the sound of the town waking up behind him, and he breathed and let everything settle. He was back on the Sunny by the time the first copy of the newspaper reached the docks. The crew was gathered at the rail when he arrived, and Nami took one look at his shoulder, and immediately grabbed his arm and started directing him toward Chopper with the forceful efficiency of someone who was processing multiple emotional things simultaneously, and was choosing to express them through practical action. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." "Mihawk, sit down," Chopper said, appearing with his bag open. "Did you?" Usopp's voice was trying to contain its own tension and failing. "Did you win?" Zoro sat where Chopper indicated and let the doctor work. He looked up at the crew gathered around him, every face, every expression, all the different versions of hope and apprehension and care, and he said simply, "Yes." The sound the crew made was not a cheer exactly. It was more fundamental than that, closer to the sound of people releasing something they'd been holding, a collective exhale that had relief and joy and grief all folded into it, because winning meant Zoro was both things now, and being both things meant Luffy's dream had found its landing point. Usopp made a noise and sat down on the deck and covered his face with his hands, and Nami pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, and Frankie did the full cry, the loud uncontained kind, and Brook played 3 notes again on his violin, the same 3 notes, as at Laugh Tale, the ones that meant the music he was really playing. Sanji handed him a cup of coffee, as he always did, and Zoro took it, as he always did. "Both things," Sanji said. "Yes." Sanji was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down beside him, on the deck, the same wet deck he'd sat on after the Sea Kings in the storm, and drank his own coffee, and said nothing more, and that was enough and more than enough. Nami unrolled the newspaper. The headline was across the entire front page in the largest typeface the paper had ever used, which was saying something given Logtown's history with significant events, the Void Century, the complete record, by the order of the Straw Hat Crew, Emperor of the New World. Below the headline, Robin's work began, careful, thorough, and irrefutable. She read it over Nami's shoulder with an expression that was the most completely itself she had ever been, the composite of every version of Robin that the crew had known, the scholar, and the survivor, and the person who had chosen to live, and the person who had finally, completely, given the truth the form it deserved. "It's good," she said quietly. "It's incredible," Nami said. "They're going to try to suppress it," Robin said. "Too late," Usopp said, already loading his slingshot with copies of the broadsheet. "Way too late." The copies went out over the next 2 days, the 40 locations, the pirate networks, the secondary and tertiary distribution points that Nami had mapped and Sanji's contacts had arranged and Robin's scholar network had activated. The world government's response was fast and loud and, as Robin had predicted, completely insufficient. The information was already in too many hands. The 40 had become 400. The 400 were becoming 4,000. The truth was in the water. You couldn't take it back. On the 3rd day after Logtown, a marine vessel appeared in the harbor, not a combat ship, a diplomatic cutter, flying white flags. The officer who came aboard was young and nervous and carrying a formal document that he clearly didn't want to be carrying, which meant someone had given him the job as a punishment. He handed the document to Zoro. It was a formal communication from the 5 elders, or what remained of the 5 elders, since 2 of them had apparently resigned in the 24 hours since the first newspaper had printed. The communication was carefully worded in the specific language of powerful institutions trying to acknowledge reality without fully capitulating to it. It did not concede wrongdoing. It offered, instead, a formal acknowledgement of the Straw Hat Crew's status as a recognized sovereign entity of the New World, exempt from standard pirate designation, with the specific phrasing that indicated someone on the world government side had decided that accommodation was less costly than conflict. The word Emperor appeared, deliberately, in the formal text. Zoro read the document once. He looked at the nervous young officer. "Tell them we acknowledge receipt," he said. "That's all." The officer looked like someone who had been given a much more complicated response to deal with, and was deeply relieved at the simplicity. He went back to his cutter and the cutter left the harbor quickly, which was probably for the best. Nami took the document from Zoro and read it twice. Then she filed it in the navigation room under a label that said, in her handwriting, "Proof." The Sunny left Logtown on a Tuesday morning with the tide and the wind both in her favor, which felt appropriate. The crew was on deck as they left the harbor, not because anyone had said to be, just because this was the kind of departure that called for being present on deck, for watching the town go past and the harbor entrance open and the sea expand ahead. Logtown shrank behind them, the execution platform visible until the last moment, the scaffold where Roger had stood and laughed and set everything in motion. Zoro stood at the prow. He had Chopper's fresh bandaging on his shoulder, and Sanji's breakfast in him, and all 3 swords at his hip, and the straw hat on his head. He looked at the sea ahead, the grand line stretching in both directions, the sky enormous above it, the water full of its own impossible life, and he felt the complete, specific weight of what he was carrying and the complete specific fact that he could carry it. He pulled the Roger Pirate's flag from inside his coat. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at it, the laughing skull, the ancient flag, the thing that had been left at Laugh Tale for whoever came next, and he made a decision. He walked back along the deck to the main mast, where the straw-hat Jolly Roger flew from the top, and he looked up at it for a moment. Then he passed the Roger flag to Frankie, who had appeared at his side with the specific timing of a person who had been paying close attention. "Can you get it up there?" Zoro said. Frankie looked at the flag. Looked at the mast. Looked at Zoro. His eyes were doing the thing they did just before he cried. "Super yes I can," he said. 5 minutes later, the Roger Pirate's flag flew from the secondary mast of the Thousand Sunny, below the Straw Hat Jolly Roger, the 2 flags moving together in the sea wind, the old one and the new one, the first and the continuing, the thing that had started it all and the thing that was carrying it forward. The crew looked at them together. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Usopp said very quietly, "He can see it." Nobody contradicted him. Nami came to stand beside Zoro and they looked at the open water ahead together and she said, not in the Captain Navigator voice, not in the operational voice, just in the Nami voice, the one she kept for things she meant completely. "What's next?" He looked at the sea. The sea looked back. "Everything," he said. And the Thousand Sunny, carrying 9 people and 2 flags and the weight of everything that had happened and the momentum of everything that was still to come, moved out into the blue and the wide and the alive, and the wind was with her, and she was fast. She had always been fast. She had always been going somewhere. She still was. She always would be.